Welcome to Silver Point. Please settle in and make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights. Tonight's story is a collection of secrets found in the driftwood and the tide. It is a long journey through the seasons of a lonely, magical island. We will meet ghosts who drink tea, seals who tell stories, and a keeper who watches over it all. There is nothing you need to do now but listen to the waves. Let the mist wrap around you. Sleep is coming. The girl who loved the horizon. Most children dream of becoming astronauts, or ballerinas, or firefighters. But Elara dreamed of storms. When she was a little girl, she didn't hide under the covers when the thunder rattled the windows. She pressed her face against the cold glass, watching the lightning stitch the sky and sea together. She loved the feeling of being inside something sturdy while the world outside was wild. She collected pictures of lighthouses the way other kids collected baseball cards. She knew them all: the candy-striped tower of Cape Hatteras, the granite fortress of Bell Rock, the lonely pillar of Fastnet. "It's too lonely," her friends would say. "Don't you want neighbors?" "The ocean is a neighbor," Elara would reply, "and it talks more than people do." Now, 20 years later, Elara stood on the deck of a small ferry boat, clutching a single leather suitcase and a carrier containing a very grumpy ginger cat named Barnaby. Ahead of them, rising out of the gray Atlantic mist like a finger of white chalk, was the Silver Point Lighthouse. It stood on a rocky island that was barely an acre wide. At high tide, the causeway to the mainland disappeared completely, leaving the island floating alone in the universe. It was perfect. The ferryman, a weathered old man named Mr. Finch, tossed a rope onto the wooden jetty. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked, handing her the heavy iron keys. "It's been empty for 3 years. The last keeper said the nights were noisy." Elara smiled, taking the keys. They were cold and heavy, rusted with salt. "I like a bit of noise, Mr. Finch, as long as it's the wind." She stepped onto the jetty. The air smelled of brine, wet stone, and something else. Something faint and sweet, like dried lavender. She walked up the winding stone path to the keeper's cottage, attached to the base of the tower. It was built of sturdy gray stone with a slate roof covered in bright orange lichen. Inside, the cottage was chilly but welcoming. There was a large stone fireplace, a kitchen with a deep porcelain sink, and a wall of bookshelves filled with dusty logbooks. Elara opened Barnaby's carrier. The cat stepped out, sniffed the air, sneezed, and immediately jumped onto the armchair. He circled 3 times and settled down. "Home," Elara whispered. Her first task wasn't to unpack. It was to climb. She opened the heavy oak door that led to the tower. The air inside was cool and smelled of oil and history. She began to ascend the spiral staircase. 144 steps. Her boots clicked on the iron treads. Clang, clang, clang. Round and round she went, spiraling up toward the sky. When she reached the lantern room at the top, she lost her breath. It was a cage of glass suspended in the clouds. In the center stood the Fresnel lens. It was massive, a beehive of glass prisms and brass fittings, taller than she was. It looked like a giant diamond waiting to be woken up. Elara ran her hand along the brass railing. It vibrated slightly, humming with the memory of a century of storms. She looked out. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a quilt of restless blues and grays. She felt small, but not insignificant. She felt like the pin in the map that held everything else in place. "Okay," she said to the room. "Let's wake you up." The modern light was automated, but the ritual was still there. She checked the backup generator. She polished a smudge off the glass. She flipped the switch. Hum. The rotation began. The great lens turned. The beam of light swung out over the darkening water. Flash, darkness, flash, darkness. Elara stood there for a long time, watching the rhythm she had dreamed of since she was 5. She was the keeper now, the guardian of the coast. But as night settled fully over the island, Elara realized she was hungry and cold. She went back down to the cottage. She built a fire in the hearth. The dry driftwood caught quickly, crackling and popping, filling the room with orange light. She went to the kitchen. On the counter, left by the previous keeper, or perhaps the one before that, was a heavy ceramic jar labeled Storm Tea. Curious, Elara opened it. Inside were dried herbs she recognized, mint, rosemary, and some she didn't. There were dried blue petals that sparkled slightly in the firelight. She boiled water in the copper kettle, whistling. She brewed the tea. As the steam rose from the mug, the kitchen filled with a scent that reminded her of ozone and rain on hot pavement. She took a sip. It warmed her instantly, but more than that, it sharpened her senses. She could hear the waves crashing on the rocks outside with absolute clarity. She could hear the wind singing through the weather vane. And then she heard something else. Footsteps. Not outside, inside. Coming down the spiral stairs. Clang, clang, clang. Elara froze. The ferry had left hours ago. She was the only human on the island. Barnaby didn't hiss. He just lifted his head and watched the door to the tower. The door creaked open. Standing there was a man. He was wearing a thick wool peacoat and a fisherman's cap. He had a beard white as sea foam. He looked solid, real, except that the firelight shone faintly through his coat. He looked at Elara. He looked at the tea in her hand. "Ah," he said, his voice sounding like gravel rolling in the surf. "You found the storm tea. Good, you'll need it. The unicorns are running tonight." Elara blinked. "The what?" The ghost smiled, and his eyes crinkled with kindness. "The sea unicorns, lass. Best finish your cup. It's quite a show." The logbook of impossible things. Elara sat very still, clutching her mug of storm tea. Logic told her she should be afraid. A translucent old man had just walked out of her wall. But the atmosphere in the cottage wasn't fearful. It was cozy. It felt like a grandfather visiting for Sunday dinner. The ghost took off his cap and hung it on a hook that wasn't there. "Name's Sela's," he said. "Kept this light from 1920 to 1954. Died in that armchair right there. Heart attack. Peaceful way to go, listening to the gale." Barnaby, the ginger cat, jumped down from the armchair, walked over to Sela's, and rubbed against his spectral legs. Sela's reached down and scratched the cat's ears. Barnaby purred, leaning into a hand that had no mass but apparently had plenty of affection. "Cats can always see us," Sela's noted. "Dogs just bark at empty corners, but cats, they know the score." Elara finally found her voice. "You said, unicorns." Sela's chuckled. He walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a book. It wasn't one of the official Coast Guard logs. It was a thick, leather-bound volume with no title. He placed it on the table. "The government gives you a logbook for the weather and the bulbs," Silas said. "But the keepers, we have our own log." He opened the book. The pages were yellowed and filled with different handwriting. Some script was elegant and loopy, some jagged and rushed. "Read," Silas pointed. Elara leaned forward. The entry was dated November 14, 1932. "Heavy fog tonight. The foghorn has been sounding for 6 hours. At 0200, the mist cleared around the base. Saw the herd again, about 20 of them. Their horns were glowing like bioluminescence. They galloped on top of the waves as if it were solid ground. Beautiful and terrible. They are heading north." "Sea unicorns," Silas whispered. "Not the narwhals, real horses, but made of foam and moonlight." Elara looked at the window. It was pitch black outside. "Come," Silas said. "Bring your tea, it helps you see." They climbed the spiral stairs together. Elara noticed that Silas didn't make a sound on the metal steps anymore. He just drifted up. They reached the gallery, the outdoor walkway that circled the glass lantern room. The wind was fierce up here. It whipped Elara's hair across her face. The beam of the lighthouse swept over them. Flash, flash. "Look down," Silas commanded. "Watch the breakers." Elara looked. She saw the white foam of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks. "Relax your eyes," Silas said. "Don't look at the water, look into the movement." The storm tea had done something to her vision. Everything seemed sharper, higher contrast. Suddenly, she saw it. A wave rose up, curling to break. But instead of just collapsing into foam, the foam took shape. A mane, a neck, a long spiraling horn. A horse, white as snow, surged out of the water. It didn't sink. It galloped across the churning surface of the ocean, its hooves kicking up sprays of light. Then another, and another. A herd of 6 glowing, white horses was running alongside the waves, racing the lighthouse beam. They were silent, except for the roar of the ocean which seemed to match the rhythm of their galloping. "They are the messengers of the tide," Silas said, leaning on the railing beside her. "They only come when the current changes." Elara watched, mesmerized. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was wild magic, raw and untamed. One of the unicorns stopped. It looked up at the lighthouse. Its eyes were large and dark, like deep pools. It bowed its head, a majestic, acknowledging nod, and then dissolved back into sea foam. "Did you see that?" Elara gasped. "He welcomed you," Silas nodded. "They like the new keepers. They like to know someone is watching." They stood there until the cold seeped into Elara's bones. The herd moved on, disappearing into the dark Atlantic night. Back in the warm cottage, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Silas picked up the logbook of impossible things. "This island is a thin place, Elara," he said. "The barrier between the world of maps and the world of myths is porous here. You will see things that cannot be explained. Your job is not just to keep the ships off the rocks." He tapped the book. "Your job is to witness. If no one sees them, they fade. We keepers, we are the memory of the ocean." Elara took the book. It felt warm in her hands. "Are there others?" she asked. "Other echoes like you?" "Oh, aye," Silas laughed. Captain Tobias comes around when there's a gale, grumpy old coot, and Madame Oleander. She'll want to reorganize your kitchen. She was a witch or near enough to one. She's the one who planted the garden. He started to fade, his form becoming as wispy as the smoke from the chimney. Get some sleep, lass. His voice drifted from the corner. The light is turning, the sea is watching, you're doing fine. And then he was gone. Elara sat alone in the armchair. Barnaby jumped into her lap, purring loudly. She opened the logbook to a fresh, blank page. She picked up a pen. October 1st, arrived at Silver Point. The tea smells of rain. Met Silas, saw the horses run on the water. She closed the book. She listened to the rhythmic whoosh of the light turning above her. She had thought she came here to be alone. She smiled, listening to the wind singing in the chimney. She realized she was going to have more company than she ever imagined. The Moonflower Garden. The second night on the island of Silver Point was quieter than the first. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that felt heavy and expectant. The ocean was breathing slowly, long, rhythmic swells that lapped against the granite cliffs with a soothing hush. Hush, hush. Elara stood in the kitchen of the keeper's cottage. The room was illuminated only by the soft, amber glow of the kerosene lamp on the table and the dying embers in the hearth. She felt a restless energy. It wasn't anxiety, it was the urge to explore. She remembered what the ghost, Silas, had told her. Madame Oleander, she planted the garden. Elara picked up the heavy iron lantern. She put on her wool cardigan, wrapping it tight against the chill. Barnaby, who was currently batting at a moth near the window, decided that indoors was safer and stayed put. Elara opened the back door. The cool night air smelled of salt and damp earth. Behind the cottage, sheltered from the harsh sea winds by a high stone wall, lay the garden. In the daylight, it had looked like a tangle of weeds and briars. But now, under the light of the waxing moon, it was transformed. It was a study in silver and shadow. Elara walked down the overgrown path, her lantern casting swinging shadows on the stone walls. The plants here were not normal garden variety. There were no bright red roses or cheerful daisies. Everything here was adapted to the salt and the night. She saw ferns that uncurled like fiddleheads made of pewter. She saw tall, spiky thistles that glowed with a faint, bioluminescent blue pulse. She saw moss that covered the rocks like thick, gray velvet. But the centerpiece was in the middle of the garden. An old, gnarled tree stood there. It wasn't tall, but its branches were twisted and spreading, forming a canopy. Hanging from the branches were hundreds of white buds, tightly closed. Standing under the tree was a woman. She was not like Silas. Silas had been faint like smoke. This woman was sharper, more defined, though still translucent against the dark stone wall. She wore a long, Victorian-style dress with a high collar and a heavy apron filled with gardening tools. Her hair was piled high in a severe bun, held in place by what looked like twigs. She was pruning a branch with spectral shears. Snip. Elara stopped. Madame Oleander. The woman didn't turn immediately. She finished her cut. Then she turned, fixing Elara with a critical but not unkind gaze. "You're late," she said briskly. Her voice sounded like dry leaves rustling together. The Ipomoea alba, the moon flowers, are about to open. If you miss it, you miss the harvest for the whole month. I didn't know, Elara stammered. Well, you are the keeper, aren't you? Oleander gestured with her shears. The keeper tends the light and the land. Come here, hold the basket. She pointed to a woven willow basket sitting on the ground. Elara picked it up. It felt solid, unlike the ghost. Watch, Oleander whispered. It is midnight. As if on cue, the wind shifted. A cloud passed away from the moon. A beam of pure silver light struck the gnarled tree. The reaction was instant. The hundreds of white buds, hanging from the branches, began to shudder. Slowly, gracefully, they unfurled. It was like watching a time-lapse video. The petals spiraled open, revealing large, luminous white trumpets the size of dinner plates. And the smell. A cloud of fragrance washed over Elara. It was sweet, heady, and intoxicating. It smelled of jasmine, lemon, and vanilla, but deeper. It was a scent that made the eyelids heavy. It was the scent of pure sleep. Beautiful, Elara breathed. Useful, Oleander corrected, though she smiled a small, proud smile. These are silver moon trumpets. They only bloom for 1 hour. Their pollen is the primary ingredient for the tea of dreamless sleep. Oleander moved quickly now. Harvest the ones on the lower branches. Gently, do not bruise the petals. Elara reached up. The flowers felt cool and waxy, like living silk. She snapped the stems gently as Oleander instructed, placing the glowing blooms into the basket. For an hour, they worked in silence. The ghost and the girl. The only sounds were the snip of the shears and the distant ocean. It was peaceful work. There was a rhythm to it. Find the flower, check the bloom, harvest, place. Elara felt her mind quieting down. The worries of her move, the strangeness of the island, it all faded away in the face of the task. When the basket was full, the moon passed behind the lighthouse tower. The remaining flowers on the tree seemed to sigh, and then they closed up tight, turning back into nondescript buds. The magic hour was over. Good, Oleander nodded, wiping her spectral hands on her apron. Bring them inside. I will show you how to dry them. You cannot just leave them out or they turn to mush. Back in the kitchen, the warmth of the fire felt wonderful. Madame Oleander hovered by the large wooden table. She instructed Elara on how to string the flowers up by their stems to hang from the rafters. Why dreamless sleep? Elara asked, tying a string around a white stem. Don't people want to dream? Not always, Oleander said softly. She looked at the fire. Sailors see terrible things in storms. Keepers see ships break on the rocks. Sometimes the mind needs a break. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give a soul is blankness, quiet, a night where nothing happens. She looked at Elara. You have busy eyes, girl. You look at everything. You will need this tea too someday. Elara looked at the rows of white flowers now hanging from her ceiling. They looked like sleeping bats made of light. Thank you, Madame Oleander. HMPH, the ghost sniffed, though she looked pleased. Just keep the weeds out of my nightshade patch and we'll get along fine. Oh, and tell that cat of yours to stop digging up my mint. With that, she faded. She didn't walk out the door. She simply dissolved into the shadows of the kitchen, becoming part of the scent of drying herbs. Elara sat at the table. Her hands smelled of the sweet, heavy perfume of the moonflowers. She yawned, a deep, jaw-cracking yawn. Just handling the flowers had made her sleepy. She opened the logbook of impossible things. October 2nd. Met Madame Oleander. She is strict but knows the earth. We harvested the moonflowers at midnight. The kitchen smells like heaven. Note to self, Barnaby needs to stay out of the mint. She closed the book. She climbed the stairs to her small bedroom under the eaves. She didn't need the tea tonight. The peace of the garden was enough. She lay in bed, listening to the lighthouse beam turning above her. Hum, whoosh, hum, whoosh. It was the heartbeat of her new home. And now, with the flowers drying downstairs, the house smelled like magic. Elara closed her eyes and fell into a deep, dark, restful sleep, exactly as the moonflowers promised. The Selkie's song. Morning at Silver Point did not always mean sunlight. On the fourth day, Elara woke up to a world that had been erased. A thick, white fog had rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the ocean, the sky, and even the top of the lighthouse tower. From her bedroom window, she couldn't see the water. She could only hear it. The waves sounded different in the fog, muffled, closer, intimate. Slap, hiss, slap, hiss. Barnaby was sitting on the windowsill, staring intently into the white void, his tail twitching. Elara dressed in her thickest wool sweater and pulled on her yellow rubber boots. Fog meant moisture. Everything would be slick. She went downstairs. The kitchen was cold. She made a pot of coffee, the smell of roasted beans cutting through the damp, salty air. She took her mug and walked out onto the gallery of the lighthouse. The fog was cold against her cheeks. It tasted of pure brine. It swirled around the railings like living smoke. Elara loved the fog. It made the world feel small and private. It felt like the island was the only thing that existed in the universe. Then she heard the singing. It came from the cove below, a small, sheltered inlet filled with round, smooth stones. It wasn't a bird. Gulls screeched, they didn't sing. It wasn't the wind. The air was dead calm. It was a voice, a high, mournful, haunting melody that climbed up the scale and slid back down, weaving in and out of the sound of the waves. It sounded like a violin played underwater. It sounded like heartbreak. Elara set her mug down. She had to see. She descended the spiral stairs and exited the cottage. She followed the narrow, rocky path down to the cove. The stones were slippery with sea spray and algae. She moved carefully. As she got closer to the water, the singing stopped abruptly. Elara froze behind a large boulder covered in barnacles. She peeked around the edge. The cove was shrouded in mist, but she could see the dark outline of the rocks jutting out of the gray water. Sitting on a flat rock about 20 feet offshore was a creature. From the waist down, it was sleek and dark, like a seal. But from the waist up, it was a woman, or the suggestion of a woman. Her skin was pale and luminous like a pearl. Her hair was long and dark, plastered against her back like wet seaweed. She was looking out to sea, her back to Elara. Resting on the rock beside her was a dark, folded skin. A seal's skin. A Selkie, Elara breathed. She knew the myths. Selkies were seals in the water, but they could shed their skins to become human on land. They were creatures of two worlds, never fully belonging to either. The Selkie turned her head. She had large, dark eyes that were entirely black. No whites, no irises. Just the deep ocean staring back. She didn't look frightened. She looked incredibly sad. She let out a sound, not a song this time, but a keen, a cry of longing. Elara stepped out from behind the rock. She didn't want to hide. "Hello," Elara said softly. Her voice was swallowed by the fog. The Selkie looked at her. She didn't move to put on her skin. She just watched. "Are you lost?" Elara asked. It was a silly question. How could a creature of the ocean be lost in the ocean? The Selkie tilted her head. She raised a hand, webbed between the delicate fingers, and pointed toward the horizon where the fog was thickest. "The clan is gone," a voice whispered in Elara's head. Elara gasped. The Selkie hadn't spoken with her mouth. The voice had come directly into Elara's mind, sounding like water rushing over stones. "They went north," Elara asked, remembering the unicorns. "They followed the herring," the voice rippled. I stayed. I stayed for the man who lived in the stone tower." Elara looked up at the lighthouse, barely visible in the mist. "Sela's." The Selkie nodded. A tear, or maybe just a drop of sea spray, rolled down her pale cheek. "He is gone," the Selkie projected. "I felt his light go out many tides ago, but I still come to sing for him when the fog is thick. He liked the song." Elara felt a lump in her throat. This creature had been waiting, mourning, returning to this rock year after year. "He is still here," Elara said gently. "In a way, he is part of the light now." The Selkie looked at the tower. "Echoes," she whispered. "We are all echoes." She reached out and touched the dark skin beside her. "The water is cold today," she said to Elara, "but the land is colder without him." "Would you like?" Elara hesitated. "I have tea, it's warm." The Selkie smiled. It was a strange, alien smile, revealing sharp little teeth. "You are kind, new keeper, but I need the salt, I need the deep." She picked up the skin. In one fluid motion, she pulled it over her shoulders. The transformation was seamless. The pale woman vanished. In her place was a sleek gray harbor seal. The seal barked, a sharp, joyful sound that broke the melancholy of the moment. It slid off the rock and into the water with a soft bloop. The seal surfaced once, looking at Elara with those deep black eyes. Then it dove, disappearing into the gray water. Elara stood on the beach for a long time. The fog began to lift slightly, revealing patches of pale blue sky. She walked back up the path to the cottage. Her coffee was cold, but she didn't mind. She went inside. Sela's wasn't there. He usually only came out at night, but she spoke to the empty room anyway. "She was here, Sela's. She sang for you." The fire in the hearth flared up suddenly, crackling loudly, as if in acknowledgement. Elara sat at her desk. She opened the logbook. October 4th. Heavy fog. Visibility near zero. Encountered a Selkie in the lower cove. She was a friend of Sela's. Her song is the saddest and most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Note, the ocean remembers love just as well as people do. She closed the book. She spent the rest of the day cleaning the brass of the lens, polishing it until it shone like gold. She realized that being a keeper wasn't just about keeping ships safe. It was about keeping the stories safe. That night, when she lit the lamp, she felt a double sense of purpose. She was lighting the way for the ships, yes, But she was also keeping a candle burning for the seal in the dark water, letting her know that her friend was still remembered. The beam swept out, flash, flash. And from the darkness of the sea, Elara thought she heard a faint, distant bark in reply. The Glassblur's storm. The Atlantic Ocean does not anger easily, but when it does, the world trembles. It was the 7th day of Elara's stay on Silver Point, and the barometer in the hallway had dropped like a stone. The needle pointed past rain and wind, resting deep in the red zone marked gale. The sky turned a bruised purple-black long before sunset. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It tore around the cylindrical tower of the lighthouse, searching for a handhold, searching for a way in. Wooed Elara. Inside the cottage, Elara felt safe. The stone walls were 3 feet thick. They had stood against hurricanes for 100 years, but the noise was deafening. Barnaby was not happy. The ginger cat was pacing the rug, his ears flattened, tail twitching. Every time a particularly strong gust slammed against the slate roof, he looked at Elara with wide, accusing eyes. "It's okay, Barnaby," she soothed, though she had to raise her voice. "The house isn't going anywhere." She made a pot of tea, a dark, robust blend she named Anchor Tea, with heavy notes of roasted dandelion root and cinnamon. It tasted like earth and stability. Then she remembered the light. In a storm like this, the vibration could damage the mechanism. She needed to check the lens. She climbed the spiral stairs. The wind noise grew louder with every step. By the time she reached the lantern room, it felt like she was standing inside a drum. Rain was lashing against the heavy glass panes, blurring the world into streaks of gray and black. The great Fresnel lens was rotating steadily. Hum, click, hum, click. But as Elara circled the walkway, inspecting the brass fittings, she noticed something. On a lower shelf, tucked behind a box of spare bulbs, was a small iron door set into the wall of the tower itself. She hadn't noticed it before. It was painted the same white as the brick. Curiosity pricked at her. She tugged the handle. It was stiff with rust, but it gave way. Inside was not a storage cupboard, but a narrow, descending staircase. Not the main stairs. These were tighter, steeper, leading down into the very foundation of the island. Elara hesitated. The storm howled outside, but the air wafting up from the hidden stairs was warm. It smelled of wood smoke and silica. She grabbed her lantern and descended. Down, 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 past the level of the cottage, into the bedrock. She emerged into a circular room carved out of the stone. It was a workshop, but not for boats or nets. In the center of the room stood a cold brick furnace. Along the walls were shelves filled with jars of colored sands, metal blowpipes, and tongs. And shards of glass, thousands of them. Blue shards, amber shards, clear shards. They glittered in her lantern light like a dragon's hoard. This was a Glassblur's sanctuary. Careful with the light, a voice boomed. Elara jumped, nearly dropping her lantern. Standing by the cold furnace was a man. He was huge, broad-shouldered, with arms like tree trunks scarred from years of burns. He wore a leather apron over a soot-stained shirt. His beard was red and wild, like a fire hazard. He was translucent, glowing with a warm, inner orange light. "You must be the new keeper," he grunted. "I'm Ignatius. I made the eyes." "The eyes," Elara whispered. "The lens," Ignatius gestured to the ceiling. "The prisms, the jewels that catch the fire and throw it across the water. I blew every piece of that Fresnel lens with my own lungs." He picked up a blowpipe from the bench. Even though he was a ghost, the tool seemed to shimmer in his grip. "It's a bad night up there," Ignatius said, looking at the ceiling as if he could see through the rock. "The vibration, it shakes the crystals. If the glass isn't happy, the light fractures." He walked over to a workbench. Lying there was a spare prism, a triangular piece of glass about the size of a loaf of bread. It had a hairline crack down the center. "This one broke in the storm of '96, Ignatius said sadly. "I've been trying to fix it, but ghosts have no breath." He looked at Elara. His eyes burned with intensity. "But you do. You have breath, you have heat." "I don't know how to blow glass," Elara said. "You don't need to blow it," Ignatius said. "You need to heal it. Glass is just sand that learned how to be transparent. It wants to be whole." He pointed to the furnace. "Imagine the fire, girl. You are the keeper. You keep the light, but you also keep the heat." Elara stepped closer. She looked at the cracked prism. It was dull, lifeless. She closed her eyes. She listened to the storm raging far above. She thought about the heat of the tea in her stomach. She thought about the fire in her cottage hearth. She visualized that heat flowing down her arms, into her hands. She placed her hands on the cold glass prism. "That's it," Ignatius encouraged, his voice dropping to a rumble. "Don't force it, just warm it. Remind it of the kiln. Remind it of the moment it became liquid." Elara felt a strange sensation. Her palms grew incredibly hot, but they didn't burn. It was a pleasant, humming heat. Under her hands, the glass began to glow. First a dull red, then a bright cherry orange. The crack in the center began to seal. The molecules of the glass, remembering their liquid state, flowed back together. It was like watching a wound heal in fast motion. "Yes," Ignatius shouted. "Hold it, the intention must be clear." Elara focused. "Be whole, be clear, be strong." The orange glow faded. The glass cooled. Elara took her hands away. The prism was perfect, crystal clear, not a scratch on it. It sat on the bench, vibrating slightly as if it were humming a happy tune. Ignatius let out a roar of laughter. He slapped his spectral knee. "A natural, I knew it. The island chooses the right ones." He leaned in close to Elara. He smelled of ozone and scorched pine. "Listen to me, Keeper. That storm upstairs, it's just noise. Glass doesn't care about noise. Glass cares about clarity. As long as you stay clear inside," he tapped his chest, "the light will never go out." The storm raged all night. The wind hit hurricane force. But Elara sat in the basement workshop with Ignatius, listening to his stories about the different colors of sand and how to capture a sunbeam in a bottle. When morning came, the wind died. Elara climbed back up the stairs, exhausted but exhilarated. She checked the great lens in the tower. It was spinning perfectly, throwing rainbows across the wet floor. She went down to the kitchen. Barnaby was asleep on the rug, looking undisturbed. Elara looked at her hands. They looked normal, but they felt warm. She knew that if she touched the window pane, she would feel the memory of the sand within it. She poured a fresh cup of tea. To Ignatius, she toasted to the empty room. The fire in the hearth popped, sending a single orange spark up the chimney. The Library of Driftwood. The morning after a gale is a time of discovery. The ocean, having spent all its energy in the night, was now deceptively calm. It lay flat and blue, sparkling under a clean, innocent sun. The air was scrubbed clean. But the beach told a different story. Elara walked down the path to the cove. The shoreline had changed. The sand had shifted, revealing new rocks and burying old ones. And everywhere there was debris. Seaweed was piled high in tangled mounds like mermaid hair. Shells, millions of them, formed pink and white drifts. But Elara was looking for wood. Driftwood, Silas had told her once, is the ocean's way of writing letters. Barnaby trotted beside her. He hated getting his paws wet, so he picked his way delicately across the dry stones, inspecting crab shells with suspicion. Elara walked along the tide line. She found a piece of a crate stamped with faded black letters. VRPOOL. She found a smooth, gray branch that looked exactly like a dancer's leg. She found a heavy beam of oak, dark and hard as iron, that must have come from a ship sunk a century ago. But then she found the books. They weren't paper books. They were pieces of wood that had been shaped by the sea into flat, rectangular slabs. She picked one up. It was pale, bleached by the sun and salt. On its surface, carved by the teeth of shipworms and the erosion of sand, were markings. To anyone else, they would look like random scratches. But Elara, sensitized by the magic of the island, saw patterns. One piece looked like a map of a coastline that didn't exist. Another piece had a grain pattern that spiraled like a galaxy. A third piece, a heavy block of teak, had deep grooves that looked like musical notation. Elara sat down on a dry log. She held the music wood to her ear. She listened. Faintly, trapped within the fibers of the wood, she heard a sound. Creak, groan, splash. It was the sound of a ship's hull moving through the water. It was a memory of travel. "You've come a long way," she whispered to the wood. Barnaby meowed. He was pawing at something half buried in the sand. Elara went over to him. It was a small, cylindrical piece of wood. A stopper. No, a bobber from a fishing net. It was painted red, though most of the paint had chipped away. Carved into the side were initials, J+M and a date, 1952. A love token. Lost at sea, tumbled in the dark for 70 years, and finally delivered to her doorstep. Elara felt a responsibility. These weren't just trash. They were artifacts. They were the lost stories of the Atlantic. She spent the whole morning collecting. She filled her canvas bag until it was heavy. She carried them back up the steep path to the cottage. The living room of the cottage had a long, empty wall near the fireplace. Elara decided this would be the place. She didn't use nails or glue. She simply stacked the wood. She placed the heavy ship's beam at the bottom as a foundation. She arranged the flat pages of driftwood on top. She placed the red bobber in a niche. She arranged the dancer's leg and the spiral galaxy wood. It became a sculpture, a chaotic, beautiful bookshelf of sea memories. As she placed the final piece, A sliver of silver wood that looked like a bird's wing. The room changed. The smell of the ocean intensified indoors. The air felt fresher, saltier. And suddenly, the wood began to whisper. It wasn't a spooky sound. It was a background murmur, like the sound of a busy cafe or a library reading room. It was the sound of stories settling in. Silas appeared in the armchair. He didn't look at Elara, he looked at the driftwood wall. He nodded slowly. That piece there, he pointed to a dark fragment of mahogany. That's from the Hespero. Went down in 28. I saw her lights go out. He pointed to a piece of pale pine. And that looks like a crate of oranges from Spain. We ate oranges for weeks when that one washed up. He looked at Elara with respect. You are building an archive, Keeper. The ocean appreciates it. She hates to be forgotten. Elara sat back on her heels. She looked at her collection. It wasn't gold or jewels. It was just trash to most people. But to her, it was precious. I'll call it the Library of Driftwood, she said. Barnaby walked up to the wall. He sniffed the J+M bobber. Then he curled up directly beneath the ship's beam. He seemed to like the energy of it. That evening, Elara didn't read a book. She didn't write in her log. She just sat by the fire, drinking a cup of memory tea, rosemary and sea salt, and listened to her wall. She heard the squeak of rigging. She heard the shout of sailors. She heard the laughter of a couple carving their initials into a fishing float. The lighthouse beam swept overhead. Flash, flash. The cottage was full of voices, but Elara felt peaceful. She was the librarian of the lost, and the library was open. The aurora in a bottle. The winter nights on Silver Point were long. The sun dipped below the horizon at 4 in the afternoon and didn't return until 8 the next morning. For some, this darkness would be oppressive, but for Elara, it was a canvas. It was a Tuesday in November. The air was exceptionally cold. Frost had formed on the window panes of the cottage, creating intricate fern-like patterns that sparkled in the lamplight. Elara was sitting by the fire, mending a wool sock. Barnaby was asleep on the mantelpiece, absorbing the rising heat like a furry sponge. Suddenly, the door to the tower creaked open. Silas stood there. He looked agitated, or as agitated as a calm ghost ever gets. His form was shimmering more brightly than usual. Put down the needle, lass, he said. The sky is waking up. Elara looked at him. Is it a storm? No, Silas smiled, pointing upward. It's the dancers. Haven't seen them this far south in 40 years. Grab your jars. My jars. Glass, Silas commanded gently. Clean glass. You'll want to keep some of this. Elara didn't question him. She went to the pantry and found 3 large mason jars she used for storing dried beans. She emptied the beans into a bowl and wiped the jars clean until they squeaked. She put on her heaviest coat, a scarf and mittens. She grabbed the jars. She climbed the tower. When she stepped out onto the gallery, she gasped. The world had turned green. The aurora borealis was blazing above the ocean. Great ribbons of emerald, violet, and pale rose were unfurling across the stars. They moved slowly, majestically, like giant curtains blown by a cosmic wind. It was silent. That was the strangest part. Something so massive should make a sound, a roar, a crackle. but there was only the soft hush of the waves below. Elara walked to the railing. The light from the aurora was bright enough to read by. It turned her skin pale green. It made the white ocean foam look like jade. "Beautiful," she whispered. Silas was standing next to the lens, looking up with a look of pure reverence on his weathered face. "The old sailors used to say it was the spirits of the drowned playing ball," Silas said softly. "But I think it's just the universe stretching its limbs." He looked at the jars in Elara's hands. "Well," he said, "don't just stand there, catch it." "How?" Elara asked. "It's light, it's miles away." "Light is everywhere," Silas corrected. "It reflects, it saturates. The air right here is full of it, you just have to invite it in." He demonstrated with his spectral hands. He held them out, cupped, as if catching rain. Elara unscrewed the lid of the first jar. She held it up to the sky. She didn't try to scoop the air. She just held it steady, focusing on the greenest part of the ribbon directly above her. She imagined the light pouring down like water. She imagined the jar acting like a magnet. "Phil," she thought, "come inside." Inside the glass jar, the air began to swirl. It wasn't just reflection. A faint, glowing mist began to pool at the bottom of the jar. It was a soft, phosphorescent green, like a captured firefly, but diffuse. The jar grew heavier. Not physically heavy, but energetically heavy. "That's it," Silas whispered. "Cap it, quick." Elara screwed the lid on tight. The glow remained. Trapped inside the jar was a cloud of living emerald light. It swirled gently, pulsing in time with the lights in the sky. She picked up the second jar. This time, she focused on a streak of violet. She held the jar up. She waited. The purple light felt cooler, slower. It drifted into the jar like smoke. She sealed it. For the third jar, she waited for a rare flash of pink. It took longer. The pink was shy. But eventually, a soft blush filled the glass container. Elara stood on the gallery with her 3 lanterns of magic. Green, purple, pink. They were dim, not bright enough to light a room, but bright enough to comfort a child. The cold finally bit through her mittens. The lights in the sky began to fade, retreating back to the Arctic. "Thank you," she whispered to the sky. She carried her treasure back down the spiral stairs. Inside the cottage, she placed the jars on the mantelpiece above the fire. They looked magical. The firelight danced on the glass, but inside, the cold, cosmic light continued to swirl. Barnaby opened one eye. He looked at the green jar. He chattered at it the way he chattered at birds. He could see the movement inside. "What are they for?" Elara asked Silas, who was fading back into his favorite chair. "Winter is dark, Elara," Silas murmured, his voice growing faint. "Sometimes the fire isn't enough. Sometimes you need a light that doesn't burn, a light that reminds you of the vastness." He closed his eyes. "And besides," he added with a sleepy chuckle, "they make excellent nightlights if you need to use the privy in the middle of the night." Elara smiled. She turned off the oil lamp. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the dying embers and the 3 jars. The green jar cast a soothing, forest-like glow on the rug. The violet jar cast deep, dreamlike shadows on the beams. The pink jar sat quietly, glowing like a dawn that hadn't happened yet. Elara sat in the dark for a long time, just watching her bottled stars. She felt a profound sense of connection. She had a piece of the sky in her living room. She went to bed that night without closing her curtains. She didn't need to. She had her own private aurora watching over her sleep. The Kitchen Witch. 3 days after the aurora, the Greys arrived. The Greys was Elara's name for a specific type of island weather and a specific type of mood. The sky was a flat sheet of slate. The ocean was the color of iron. The rain wasn't a dramatic storm. It was a relentless, drizzling mist that soaked into everything. Elara felt it in her bones. She felt heavy. The isolation of the lighthouse, usually a joy, suddenly felt like a weight. I need comfort food, she decided. She went to the kitchen. She decided to bake bread. She mixed the flour and water. She added the yeast. She set the bowl near the fire to rise. She waited an hour. She checked the bowl. Nothing. The dough sat there, a dense gray lump. It looked as sad as the weather outside. "Rise," Elara commanded. The dough ignored her. She sighed. She felt tears pricking her eyes. It was silly to cry over dough, but it felt like a failure. "You're doing it wrong," a voice rasped. Elara turned. Madame Oleander was standing by the stove. She looked particularly solid today, her Victorian dress crisp, her hair pulled back so tight it pulled her spectral eyebrows up. She was holding a wooden spoon that looked very real. "It's just yeast," Elara sniffed, wiping her eyes. "Maybe it's old." "Yeast is alive," Oleander snapped, floating closer to inspect the bowl. "It feels what you feel. You are projecting gloom into the gluten. Of course it won't rise, it's depressed." Elara looked at the bowl. "I can depress dough." "You are the keeper," Oleander said, as if this explained everything. "Your energy feeds this house. If you are cold, the hearth smokes. If you are sad, the bread is flat." She pointed the spoon at Elara. "Wash your hands, warm them. We are going to do this again, the old way." Elara washed her hands in hot water until they were pink. "Now," Oleander instructed, "pour the flour, but do not just dump it, sift it. Imagine you are sifting light into the grain." Elara sifted. The white powder fell like snow. "Add the water. Now the yeast. Wake it up. Whisper to it." Elara felt ridiculous. She leaned over the bowl. Wake up, please." "With conviction," Oleander barked. "Tell it what it is going to become. It is going to be a golden tower of sustenance." "You are going to be delicious," Elara whispered fiercely. "You are going to be warm and fluffy." "Better," Oleander nodded. "Now the kneading. This is the most important part. Do not punch it. You are not fighting it. You are massaging life into it." Elara pushed her palms into the dough. It felt cool and sticky. "Clockwise," Oleander commanded. "Always sunwise. Even when the sun isn't shining outside, you must make the sun in the bowl. Turn, fold, push. Turn, fold, push." Elara fell into the rhythm. "Now hum," Oleander said. "Hum. A kitchen needs a song. It doesn't matter the tune. The vibration wakes up the proteins." Elara started to hum a tune she remembered from childhood. A simple lullaby. Hum. She kneaded. She hummed. She turned the dough sunwise. Slowly, the atmosphere in the kitchen changed. The smell of the wet dog, Barnaby, had been out in the rain, and the damp wool faded. The air began to smell. Sweet. The dough started to change texture under her hands. It became elastic. It became smooth. It started to feel warm, as if it were generating its own heat. "It's breathing," Elara whispered. She could feel tiny bubbles popping under her palms. "It is happy now," Oleander said, looking satisfied. "Cover it with the red cloth. Set it by the fire. Do not peek." Elara covered the bowl. They waited. Madame Oleander didn't disappear. She hovered by the window, criticizing the way Elara had arranged the spice jars, but her tone was softer. "My grandmother taught me," Oleander said, looking at the rain. "She was a kitchen witch. She said a loaf of bread baked with anger will give you a stomachache, but a loaf baked with hope, that is medicine." An hour passed. Elara lifted the cloth. The dough had doubled, no, tripled in size. It was a magnificent, puffy dome of potential. "Into the oven," Oleander commanded. "Middle rack." 40 minutes later, the smell hit them. It was the best smell in the world. Better than the moonflowers. Better than the sea. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of safety. Elara pulled the loaf out. It was golden brown, hollow when tapped and perfect. She sliced a piece while it was still too hot, burning her fingers slightly. She slathered it with butter. She took a bite. It tasted like warmth. It tasted like a hug. The graze inside her chest evaporated instantly. "Good?" Oleander asked, watching her closely. "Magic," Elara mumbled with her mouth full. "Just chemistry and intention," Oleander corrected, fading slightly. "Remember, Keeper, you are the ingredient that matters most." She disappeared. Elara sat at the table, eating her magic bread. Barnaby woke up and demanded a crumb of cheese to go with it. Outside, the rain still fell, gray and relentless. But inside the kitchen, it was warm, it smelled of yeast, and Elara felt completely, perfectly fine. She opened the logbook. November 10th. The Greys arrived, attempted to bake. Madame Oleander intervened, learned that yeast has feelings and that kneading requires a song. Result, the best bread I have ever eaten. Mood, rising. She closed the book and brushed the crumbs off the cover. The Clockwork Crab. Wednesday morning began with an extreme low tide. The ocean had retreated far beyond its usual line, exposing a stretch of the seabed that rarely saw the sun. It was a landscape of wet stones, deep tidal pools, and tangled kelp that smelled of salt and secrets. Elara loved these mornings. It felt like the ocean was taking a deep breath in, revealing the hidden floor of the world before exhaling the tide back out. She took her canvas bag and walked down to the rocky flats. Barnaby, the ginger cat, followed her. He stepped gingerly from one dry rock to another, shaking his paws with disdain whenever he misjudged a step and touched the damp sand. They wandered among the pools, looking at the vibrant red starfish and the small hermit crabs scurrying for cover. In one particularly deep crevice, something caught the light. It wasn't the pearlescent shine of a shell or the glint of sea glass. It was metal. It was dull and greenish from oxidation, but it was unmistakably crafted by human hands. Elara rolled up her sweater sleeve and reached into the cold water. Her fingers closed around the object. It was heavy. She pulled it out and held it up to the morning light. It was a crab, but it was not alive. It was made of copper and brass, intricately constructed with joints and rivets. Its shell was etched with fine lines that looked like a star chart, depicting constellations and lines of latitude. Its claws were complex mechanisms held together by tiny springs. It was beautiful, cold, and completely motionless. Barnaby sniffed the metal creature and sneezed. It smelled of old copper and the deep sea. Elara brought the find back to the cottage. She spread an old newspaper on the kitchen table and placed the mechanical crab in the center. It looked ancient. Perhaps it had fallen from a ship 100 years ago, or maybe it was a toy made by a lonely clockmaker. She fetched her toolkit, small screwdrivers, a soft cloth, and a bottle of fine machine oil. For the next 2 hours, the cottage was filled with the quiet atmosphere of focused work. Elara gently scraped away the green verdigris and the dried algae. Beneath the layers of time, the warm, golden glow of the brass began to emerge. She cleaned the sand from the joints of the legs. She oiled the hinges of the claws. Then she turned it over. On the underside, nestled among a complex array of gears, was a small keyhole. But there was no key. Elara sighed. Without a key, it was just a statue, a beautiful paperweight. She sat back, admiring the craftsmanship. It was a shame. She imagined it walking, wondering what kind of movement the creator had designed. Suddenly, Barnaby jumped onto the table. He batted at something near the crab's claw. Elara looked closely. The cleaning oil had loosened the mechanism of the right claw. It had opened slightly, releasing a small object it had been gripping tightly for who knows how long. It was a tiny silver key, set with a small pearl at the top. Elara picked it up, her heart beating a little faster. The crab had been holding its own key, keeping it safe through the tides and the storms. She inserted the key into the winding hole. It fit perfectly. She turned it. The mechanism was stiff, but it gave way with a satisfying resistance. She wound it once, twice, 3 times. Inside the metal shell, she could feel the tension of a mainspring tightening, storing potential energy. She set the crab down on the wood and pulled her hands away. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ruby-red glass eyes suddenly flared with an inner light. A soft, rhythmic whirring sound began. It was the sound of tiny gears meshing together perfectly. The left legs twitched, the right legs extended. With surprising grace, the crab pushed itself up. It waved its claws in a greeting motion. Then it began to move. It didn't just walk, it danced. It skittered sideways across the table, its metal legs tapping a precise, musical rhythm on the wood. It moved with a personality that seemed curious and lively. Barnaby's eyes went wide. He lowered his head, tracking the movement. The cat reached out a paw and gently tapped the metal shell. The crab stopped. It swiveled its body to face the cat. It raised its claws and snapped them softly, not aggressively, but playfully. Then it scurried away, winding around the sugar bowl. Barnaby leaped after it, entranced by the whirring sound. It was a game of tag. The crab would run, then pause, waiting for the cat to catch up before darting away again. Elara laughed, watching them. The cottage felt less lonely instantly. "I'll call you Horatio," she decided. Horatio, the timekeeper. That evening, the little crab explored the entire ground floor. It discovered it could climb the rough fabric of the armchair. It found that the warmth of the fireplace made its gears run smoother. But the most magical moment came at night. When Elara went to bed, she heard a faint, steady sound. Horatio had climbed up to the windowsill in her bedroom. He sat there, bathing in the moonlight, his ruby eyes watching the stars. His internal mechanism ticked with a steady, soothing beat that matched the rhythm of the lighthouse beam above. Barnaby curled up next to the metal crab, resting his chin on his paws. Elara realized that for the first time, Barnaby had a friend who wouldn't disappear when the sun rose. She closed her eyes, lulled to sleep by the dual rhythms of the ocean outside and the copper heart beating inside. In her logbook of impossible things, she wrote, November 12th, found a mechanism in the tide pool, restored it. We now have a clockwork crab named Horatio living with us. He runs on spring tension and curiosity. Barnaby is delighted. It seems this island provides exactly what we need, even if we didn't know we needed a metal crustacean. The fog warning. A week after Horatio joined the household, the world vanished. The fog arrived not as a drifting cloud, but as a solid wall. It rolled in off the Atlantic, heavy, wet, and absolutely impenetrable. From the gallery of the lighthouse, Elara couldn't even see the ground below. It felt as if the tower were floating in a white void, disconnected from the earth. Lighthouses are not just about light. When the light cannot penetrate the gloom, the sound must take over. Elara activated the foghorn. It was a massive pneumatic system. It drew air into great tanks and then expelled it through a giant resonator facing the sea. The sound was immense. It was a deep bass note that vibrated through the stone walls, through the floorboards, and settled deep in Elara's chest. It blasted once every 30 seconds, a long, mournful note that warned ships to keep their distance. For 2 days, this was the rhythm of Elara's life. The steady, earth-shaking vibration of the horn. On the 3rd day of the fog, Elara was sitting in the library. Horatio was ticking quietly on the mantelpiece. Barnaby was hiding under the sofa as he despised the loud noise. Suddenly, the rhythm broke. Elara looked up from her book. She knew the machine perfectly. It was set to a strict timer. But the silence stretched out. 30 seconds became 40, then 50. Then the horn sounded again. But it was different. It wasn't the uniform, mechanical blast she was used to. It was shorter, more urgent. It varied in pitch, sliding from a low note to a slightly higher one. It didn't sound like a machine. It sounded like a voice. Elara rushed to the door. She grabbed her coat and climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room, then stepped out onto the damp gallery. The fog was thick and cold against her face. She gripped the railing, peering into the whiteness. The lighthouse horn blasted again. This time, it let out a long, wavering groan that sounded almost like a question. And then, from the invisible ocean below, an answer came. It was a sound that made the hair on Elara's arms stand up. It was a deep, resonant vibration, ancient and powerful. It sounded like the creaking of a massive door or a cello played by a giant. A whale. Elara realized what was happening. A whale, likely a massive one, had become disoriented by the shallow waters and the distorting fog. It was swimming dangerously close to the jagged rocks of Silver Point. And the lighthouse knew. The spirit of the tower, the collective energy of the stone, the glass, and the keepers who had come before, had overridden the automatic timer. It was using the horn to speak. The lighthouse let out a series of short, sharp blasts. A warning, turn away, turn away. The whale responded with a confused, high-pitched keen that rippled through the mist. The splash of water below was loud enough to be heard over the wind. The creature was dangerously close. Elara pressed her hands against the cold brick of the tower. "Guide him," she whispered. "Show him the way." The lighthouse horn changed its tone again. It emitted a long, steady, low frequency that seemed to point toward the deep water. It was a calming sound, a sonic anchor in the confusion. The silence followed. Elara held her breath, listening to the slap of the waves against the cliff. Then, from further out in the distance, the whale called back. It was a long, ascending note, a sound of relief, a sound of farewell. The creature had found the drop-off. It was heading back to the safety of the open ocean. The lighthouse fell silent for a moment. Then, the mechanical timer clicked back in. The horn blasted its standard, uniform warning note. The rhythm returned. The machine was just a machine again, but Elara knew what she had heard. She walked back down the stairs, her coat damp with mist. She felt a profound sense of awe. She had just witnessed a conversation between a stone tower and a leviathan of the deep. She made a cup of herbal tea to settle her nerves. Barnaby crawled out from under the sofa and meowed, asking if the strange argument outside was over. "It's over," Elara told him softly. "They worked it out." She opened the logbook. November 19th. Fog persists. Today the lighthouse spoke to a whale. I heard them conversing in the mist. The tower guided the giant away from the rocks using a language of vibration. I realized today that I am not the only one keeping watch. The tower itself is alive, in its own stony way. That night, Elara fell asleep to the vibration of the horn. It no longer felt like a noise that disturbed her sleep. It felt like a heartbeat. It was the voice of a guardian, shouting into the white void, promising that no matter how thick the fog, nothing would be lost on its watch. And wrapped in that promise, she slept deeply. The star chart blanket. December arrived at Silver Point not with snow, but with a clarifying, intense cold. The wind had scoured the sky of all clouds, leaving it polished and terrifyingly clear. The ocean below looked like a sheet of black glass, moving with a heavy, slow rhythm. It was too cold to venture outside. Even Barnaby, who usually enjoyed a morning patrol of the perimeter, refused to leave the warm radius of the fireplace. Elara found herself restless. The cold had trapped her indoors for 3 days. She had read every book on the driftwood shelf. She had polished the brass of the lens until her arms ached and her reflection stared back at her from the metal. She decided to explore the only part of the cottage she hadn't touched yet, the attic. Access to the attic was through a small hatch in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway. Elara pulled the cord, and a wooden ladder slid down with a groan of old timber. She climbed up, carrying a warm lantern to light the way. The attic was chilly and smelled of dry pine, old paper, and camphor. It was a low-ceilinged space, forcing Elara to stoop as she moved among the shadows. It was filled with the detritus of a century of keepers. There were trunks filled with moth-eaten uniforms, boxes of spare wicks for oil lamps that hadn't been used since the 1920s, and stacks of yellowed maritime charts. In the corner, sitting on a rocking chair that seemed to be waiting for an occupant, was a woven basket. Elara brought the lantern closer. Inside the basket was a project frozen in time. It was a half-finished blanket. The yarn was a deep, midnight blue wool, thick, rough, and warm. Wooden knitting needles were still stuck in the stitches, holding the work in place as if the knitter had just stepped away for a moment and never returned. Elara picked it up. The wool was heavy. The pattern was intricate, involving not just simple rows, but complex cables and knots. "A waste to leave it," a gruff voice spoke from the shadows. Elara turned. Sitting on a trunk near the chimney breast was a man she hadn't met before. He was short and stout, wearing a heavy navy coat with brass buttons that gleamed in the lantern light. He had a thick white beard and held a pipe that emitted no smoke. He looked like a bulldog who had been turned into a human. Captain Tobias, Elara guessed. Silas had mentioned him. "Aye," the ghost nodded. "That was my wife's. Martha, she never finished it. The damp got to her hands in the end." He looked at the blue wool with a softness that didn't match his rough appearance. "She wanted to knit the sky," Tobias said. "She said if she couldn't sail anymore, she would bring the navigation chart into the bed." Elara looked at the pattern again. The knots weren't random. They were stars. The cables were the lines of latitude and longitude. "I can finish it," Elara offered. "I know how to knit." "Do you know the stars, girl?" Tobias challenged, raising a spectral eyebrow. "You have GPS and radar. Do you know how to find your way when the batteries die?" "Teach me," Elara said. She brought the basket down to the living room and sat by the fire. Tobias floated down and hovered by the window, looking out at the crystal-clear night sky. "Right," Tobias said. "We need silver thread for the major stars. Do you have any?" Elara dug through her sewing kit. She found a spool of silk thread, shimmering and metallic. "Good," Tobias nodded. "Now look north." Elara looked out the window. The sky was a vast dome of sparkling diamonds. "Find the Dipper, the Great Bear, Ursa Major." Elara found the familiar ladle shape, hanging over the horizon. "Knit it," Tobias commanded. 7 stars. The 2 on the end of the bowl point to Polaris. That is your anchor stitch. Elara began to work. The rhythm of knitting was a sleep-inducing magic all its own. Loop, pull, slide. Loop, pull, slide. Tobias navigated her through the wool. "Now drift east," he said, pointing with his pipe stem. "See the W shape? That is Cassiopeia. The queen. She sits high in the winter. 5 bright knots. Make them tight." Elara stitched the silver stars into the field of dark blue wool. "Now the hunter," Tobias said, his voice filled with awe. "Orion, the brightest of them all. He is rising over the water now." Elara looked. Orion was magnificent, his belt of 3 stars hanging low and perfectly aligned. "Betelgeuse is the shoulder," Tobias instructed. "It is a red star. Use a loose stitch to show its size. Rigel is the foot, blue and cold. Use a tight stitch." The night passed in a blur of wool and astronomy. Elara wasn't just knitting a blanket, She was knitting a map. She knitted the Pleiades, the seven sisters, as a cluster of tiny, delicate French knots. She knitted Sirius, the dog star, right near the bottom edge, glowing bright against the dark yarn. Barnaby watched the needles move, mesmerized by the flash of the silver thread in the firelight. As she worked, Tobias told stories. He didn't tell stories of monsters or shipwrecks. He told stories of guidance. He spoke of nights in the middle of the Pacific where the stars were the only friends he had. He spoke of how the sky was a clock, a compass, and a history book all in one. "The stars don't change," Tobias murmured. "Governments fall, coastlines erode, but Orion, he keeps hunting. Polaris keeps standing still. It is the only thing you can trust." By the time the sun began to pale the eastern horizon, the blanket was finished. It was large enough to cover the armchair. It was heavy, warm, and beautiful. The silver thread caught the firelight, creating a perfect replica of the winter sky over Silver Point. "Martha would have liked it," Tobias said quietly. He floated over to the chair. He reached out a hand to touch the wool. His hand passed through it, but the yarn seemed to fluff up, as if reacting to static electricity. "Warm," Tobias whispered. "Good job, Keeper, you know your way now." He faded away as the morning sun hit the glass of the window. Elara was exhausted but happy. Her fingers were sore, but her mind was full of constellations. She wrapped the blanket around herself. It was incredibly warm, holding the heat of the fire within its fibers. She closed her eyes. Usually when one closes their eyes, they see darkness. But wrapped in the star chart blanket, Elara saw the map. She knew exactly where north was. She knew where the hunter stood. She felt anchored, not by the ground, but by the sky. She fell asleep in the armchair, dreaming of sailing a ship made of wool through a sea made of stars. The message in the bottle. The week before Christmas brought a strange gift from the tides. The water had been high and rough, scouring the beach clean. When the waves finally receded, they left something glittering on the wet sand of the cove. Elara saw it from the gallery of the lighthouse, a flash of green glass against the gray sand. She grabbed her coat and walked down the winding path. Barnaby stayed on the porch. The wind was still too brisk for his liking. It was a bottle. It wasn't a modern plastic bottle. It was a heavy green wine bottle, the glass thick and bubbled with age. It was corked and sealed with heavy red wax that had been smoothed by the ocean. Inside, Elara could see a roll of paper. Her heart skipped a beat, a message in a bottle. It was the oldest cliché of the sea, yet holding it in her hand felt electric. Was it a shipwreck survivor, a love letter, a pirate map? She carried it back to the kitchen. She set it on the table. She used a corkscrew to carefully remove the wax and the crumbling cork. The air that escaped the bottle smelled of stale air and old nutmeg. She tipped the bottle. The paper slid out. It was a piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle at the edges. The handwriting was neat, loopy, and unmistakably feminine. Elara unrolled it gently. It wasn't a cry for help. It was titled, "Recipe for the Longest Night Pie." Elara blinked. She read on. "To whomever finds this, the winters here are long and the salt gets into your spirit. When the dark feels too heavy, bake this. It brings the sun back." Elara, keeper's wife, 1948. Below the note was a list of ingredients: blackberries for the dark night, honey for the summer sun, a pinch of sea salt for the tears we shed, lemon zest for the light crust made with cold butter and patience. Elara smiled. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a care package sent across time. "Well, Elara said to the empty room. Challenge accepted." She didn't have fresh blackberries, but she had a jar of preserves in the pantry. She had honey. She had lemons. She set to work. Baking is a different kind of magic than knitting. Knitting is about structure. Baking is about alchemy. She made the crust. She kept the butter cold, just as Elara instructed. She worked it with her fingertips until it felt like damp sand. She rolled it out on the wooden table, the flour dusting the air like snow. She mixed the filling. The dark purple of the blackberries swirled with the golden honey. It looked like the night sky before the stars come out. She grated the lemon zest, tiny sparks of yellow light falling into the darkness. She poured the filling into the crust. She wove a lattice top, over, under, over, under. She sprinkled the sea salt on top. She put it in the oven. 40 minutes later, the cottage smelled divine. It smelled of caramelized fruit and buttery pastry. It chased the smell of damp wool and old stone right out the chimney. Elara took the pie out. It bubbled thick and purple through the lattice work. She set it on the windowsill to cool. A gentle tapping sound came from the glass. Elara looked up. Standing on the outside ledge of the window was a seagull. But this wasn't one of the usual noisy scavengers. This gull was huge. Its feathers were snowy white, its beak bright yellow with a distinct red spot. It stared at the pie with an intelligence that was unnerving. It didn't squawk. It tapped again politely. Elara opened the window. A blast of cold air rushed in, mixing with the hot pie smell. "Can I help you?" Elara asked. The gull looked at the pie, then at Elara. It shuffled its feet. "You are here for the inspection, aren't you?" Elara laughed. She cut a small slice of the pie. She placed it on a saucer and set it on the outside ledge. The gull didn't gobble it. It pecked delicately at the crust. It tasted the filling. It threw its head back and let out a long, resonant call that echoed against the cliffs. It sounded like approval. The gull looked at Elara one last time, bobbed its head, and took off, soaring straight up into the wind. Elara watched it go. She had a feeling that somewhere on the other side of the veil, Elara was smiling. The pie had been delivered. Elara cut a slice for herself. She sat by the fire, wrapped in the star chart blanket she had knitted the night before. She took a bite. The tartness of the berries, the sweetness of the honey, the sharp sting of the salt. It was complex and rich. It tasted like winter and summer fighting, with summer winning just barely. She opened the logbook. December 21st, the solstice. Found a bottle, baked a history lesson. A very large bird approved of the crust. The longest night is here, but the kitchen is warm. Note, salt makes the sweet things sweeter. Barnaby jumped onto her lap, eyeing the plate. Elara gave him a tiny piece of crust. They sat there, the girl and the cat, eating pie in the middle of a dark ocean, realizing that as long as there was flour and honey, the winter couldn't touch them. The Crystal Cave. The tides of January were extreme. They were known as the King Tides, a celestial event where the moon and sun aligned to pull the ocean back further than at any other time of the year. It revealed the hidden anatomy of the coastline, exposing secrets that usually lay beneath 10 feet of churning water. It was a Thursday afternoon, though the sky was already a deep, twilight shade of indigo. The air was perfectly still and biting cold. Elara stood on the gallery of the lighthouse, looking down. The water had receded so far that the island looked larger and broader, anchored by massive roots of granite that were usually submerged. On the north side of the island, a dark opening had appeared in the cliff face. It was an archway, dripping and dark, a black mouth breathing out cool, damp air. Elara had never seen it before. She felt the pull of exploration. She put on her heavy boots, her thickest wool coat, and grabbed a powerful lantern. Barnaby watched her from the window, his tail twitching once before he turned back to the fire, clearly deciding that a wet, cold cave was no place for a civilized cat. Elara climbed down the steep, slippery rocks. The smell here was intense, a concentrated scent of brine, iodine, and ancient minerals. The rocks were covered in clusters of barnacles that clicked softly as they closed their shells against the drying air. She reached the archway and stepped inside. The light from her lantern cut through the gloom. The cave was not a small hollow, it was a cathedral. The ceiling vaulted high above her head, lost in the shadows. The floor was a series of terraced pools left behind by the retreating tide, reflecting the lantern light like black mirrors. But as she ventured deeper, the walls changed. They were no longer gray granite, they glittered. Elara raised her lantern. The entire interior of the cave was lined with salt crystals. Over centuries, the seawater had evaporated and crystallized, coating the cavern in geometric formations. Some were as small as diamonds, dusting the rock face. Others were massive, milky white pillars that looked like frozen waterfalls suspended in time. It was a palace of salt. Elara reached out a gloved hand to touch a large crystal formation. She hesitated, then took off her glove. The crystal was cold and dry. It felt smooth, polished by the endless motion of the water. Then she felt it. A vibration. The cave was humming. It was not a sound she heard with her ears, but a resonance she felt in the soles of her boots and the tips of her fingers. She realized what this place was. The island of Silver Point was hollow in places, and like a glass bottle that sings when wind blows across its rim, this cave sang when the pressure changed. The tide was beginning to turn. Far out, the ocean was pushing back. The air pressure inside the cave was shifting. The salt crystals were acting as resonators. A low, haunting tone began to fill the space. It was a pure, clean note, somewhere in the lower register of a cello. Elara stood still, letting the sound wash over her. It was the voice of the earth itself. It was a song of geology, slow and heavy and beautiful. She walked further in, navigating the tidal pools. The sound grew louder, joined by harmonies as different clusters of crystals began to vibrate at different frequencies. It was a choir of minerals. She found a dry ledge near the back of the cave and sat down. She turned down the flame of her lantern until it was just a glowing ember. In the dim light, the crystals seemed to phosphoresce. They held a faint, ghostly blue light, likely from microscopic algae trapped within the salt lattice. Elara closed her eyes. The vibration moved through her body, loosening the tension in her shoulders, untying the knots in her mind. It was a sonic massage. She imagined the lighthouse above her, standing stoic and silent, while down here in the secret heart of the island, the earth was singing. She stayed until she heard the distinct sound of a wave breaking closer to the entrance. The tide was returning. The window of opportunity was closing. She stood up, thanking the cave for its performance, and made her way back to the archway. The water was already lapping at the threshold. She had to jump across the last few rocks to reach the safety of the path. As she climbed back up to the cottage, the sun began to set, painting the sky in stripes of cold fire, orange, violet, and steel gray. Inside the cottage, the warmth hit her like a physical embrace. The fire was banked but warm. Barnaby greeted her with a chirp, sniffing her boots which now smelled of the deep earth. Elara sat in her armchair, her body still buzzing slightly from the resonance of the cave. She felt tuned, like an instrument that has finally been tightened to the correct pitch. She opened the logbook of impossible things. January 12th. Discovered the Salt Cathedral at low tide. The island is not just a rock, it is a bell. The crystals sing when the tide turns. I sat inside the music of the earth. I realized that silence is just a sound we cannot hear yet. The migrating lanterns. February brought a stillness that felt almost unnatural. The winds died down completely, and the ocean became a sheet of obsidian, reflecting the stars with perfect clarity. It was the night of the new moon. The sky was the darkest it would be all year. Elara was in the kitchen, kneading dough for tomorrow's bread, when the temperature in the room dropped significantly. She looked up. Silas was standing by the window. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking out at the black horizon. "They are coming," he said softly. "Who?" Elara asked, wiping flour from her hands. "The travelers," Silas replied. "The paper lanterns. Every year on the darkest night they migrate south." Elara wiped her hands and walked to the window. "Spirits of those who were lost at sea but found their way back to the light," Silas explained. "They drift on the current of the air, not the water. But the wind is dead tonight. They will struggle to clear the point." Elara looked out. At first, she saw nothing but the crushing blackness of the ocean. Then she saw a spark. Then another, and another. Rising from the northern horizon was a stream of soft, orange lights. They looked like paper sky lanterns, glowing from within with a warm, flickering candlelight. There were hundreds of them, floating a few feet above the surface of the water. They drifted silently, bobbing gently in the air currents. It looked as though a river of fire was flowing over the ocean. "They are beautiful," Elara whispered. "They are drifting too close to the needle," Silas warned, pointing to a jagged spire of rock that jutted out near the base of the lighthouse. "If they touch the rock, the paper tears and the light goes out. We must guide them." Elara grabbed her coat and ran out. She didn't go to the tower. She went down to the rocky shoreline. She carried a long pole made of driftwood. The air was filled with a soft, golden glow. The lanterns were silent, but they gave off a feeling of gentle warmth. As they floated closer, Elara could see that they weren't all identical. Some were round, some were square, Some looked like little boats made of parchment. The stream of lights was heading straight for the jagged rocks. Without the wind to push them, they were listless. Elara waded into the shallow water. It was freezing, numbing her ankles instantly, but she didn't stop. She reached out with her driftwood pole. The first lantern drifted toward a sharp edge of granite. Elara gently nudged it. The lantern felt weightless, like a soap bubble. With a soft push, she redirected it around the rock, sending it out toward the open channel. Silas appeared beside her, standing on top of the water. He waved his spectral arms, creating a draft of cold air that pushed a cluster of smaller lanterns away from danger. "Keep them moving, lass," he said. "The current of the night is slow." For an hour, they worked. Elara stood in the freezing surf, guiding the parade of souls. It was a silent, solemn work. She saw a lantern that looked like a folded letter. She nudged it safe. She saw one that looked like a child's toy boat. She pushed it gently past the danger. There was no fear in these lights, only a quiet determination to keep going. Horatio, the clockwork crab, had scuttled down to the beach. He sat on a dry rock, his ruby eyes glowing, clicking his claws in rhythm as the lights passed, like a tiny traffic controller. Eventually, the stream of lights thinned. The last few stragglers floated by. One final lantern, small and dim, got stuck in an eddy of air behind a large boulder. It hovered there, spinning slowly, trapped. Elara waded deeper. The water was up to her knees. She stretched out her pole. She caught the edge of the lantern and pulled it gently toward her, then swung it out wide. The lantern caught the updraft from the warmer water. It rose higher, glowing brighter as it rejoined its companions. Elara watched them go. The river of orange light wound its way south, disappearing into the vast darkness of the Atlantic. She shivered. The cold had finally registered. "Go inside," Silas said, his form fading. "They are safe now. You kept the path clear." Elara walked back up to the cottage. Her boots squelched and her hem was soaked, but she felt warm inside. She changed into dry clothes and sat by the fire. She made a cup of hot cocoa, wrapping her hands around the mug. She thought about the lanterns. She wondered where they were going. To a warmer sea, to a final resting place beyond the horizon. She realized that the lighthouse wasn't just a warning for the living. It was a waypoint for everything that traveled the ocean. Ships, whales, and even drifting memories made of paper and light. She opened the logbook. February 10th. The migration passed through tonight, a river of lanterns flowing south. We stood in the surf and guided them past the rocks. It was the quietest parade I have ever seen. Note, even spirits need a little push in the right direction sometimes. She fell asleep watching the embers of the fire, dreaming of orange lights floating against a velvet sky. The Sundial Garden. March arrived on the island with a shift in the light. The sun, which had been a low, pale coin rolling along the southern horizon all winter, finally began to climb higher. The shadows, which had stretched long and thin across the rocks for months, began to shorten. It was the day of the spring equinox, the day when light and dark are perfectly balanced. Elara woke up feeling lighter. The heavy wool blankets felt too warm for the first time. She opened the window and smelled something new in the salt air, the scent of thawing earth and damp moss. She went downstairs to find Sela's standing by the back door, looking at the garden. The ghost looked less transparent today, bolstered by the increasing sunlight. "It is the balanced day," Sela's noted, his voice sounding like a breeze through dry grass. "Watch the shadow of the tower, Elara. The architect was a clever man. He didn't just build a lighthouse, he built a clock." Elara followed him outside. The sun was approaching its zenith. The shadow of the massive lighthouse tower lay across the garden like a dark finger. As the sun moved, the shadow crept across the stone wall, across the patch of sleeping mint, and toward a large, flat gray stone in the center of the yard. "Wait for it," Sela's whispered. "Noon." Elara watched. Horatio, the clockwork crab, had scuttled out and was sitting on the stone wall, his gears clicking softly in anticipation. At exactly 12 o'clock, the tip of the lighthouse's shadow touched the very center of the flat stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the stone seemed to shimmer. A line of golden light appeared on its surface, tracing a spiral pattern that hadn't been there a moment before. "Underneath," Sela said. Elara knelt in the damp earth. She pushed against the stone. It was heavy, but it pivoted smoothly on a hidden fulcrum. Beneath the stone was a small, dry hollow lined with slate, and inside the hollow sat a metal tin, rusted shut. Elara lifted it out. It felt warm, vibrating with a gentle heat. She brought it into the kitchen. Barnaby jumped onto the table to inspect the prize. Elara pried the lid open. Inside, resting on a bed of cotton wool, were seeds. But they were not ordinary seeds. They were large, the size of marbles, and they glowed. They pulsed with a warm, amber light, like tiny embers from a fire. "Sun stars," Sela said reverently. "My grandmother planted them. They soak up the sunlight during the day and release it at night. We haven't had a bloom in 50 years. Elara looked at the glowing seeds. They felt hot in her hand, filled with concentrated solar energy. "Plant them now," Sela's instructed, "while the balance holds." Elara went back to the garden. She chose a spot along the south-facing wall where the soil was darkest. She dug 5 small holes. She placed a glowing seed in each one. As she covered them with earth, she felt the soil tremble. These seeds were eager. They didn't need weeks to germinate. They needed moments. Elara stepped back. Before her eyes, green shoots broke the surface. They grew rapidly, unfurling leaves that shimmered with veins of gold. Stems rose, thick and sturdy. And then the buds formed. They didn't open immediately. They turned their faces toward the sun, drinking in the light, storing it. Elara spent the afternoon in the garden, weeding and tidying, watching the miracle plants grow. By sunset, they were waist-high. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned violet, the magic happened. The flowers opened. They looked like lilies, but their petals were made of living light. They didn't reflect the ambient light, they generated it. A soft, warm, golden glow spilled out from the flower beds, illuminating the garden path. It wasn't a harsh electric light. It was the trapped memory of the afternoon sun, released gently into the dark. Elara sat on the garden bench. The air was getting cold, but the flowers radiated heat. It felt like sitting next to a small campfire. Barnaby walked up to one of the sun's stars and sniffed it. He closed his eyes. enjoying the warmth on his nose. Silas appeared, sitting on the wall. He looked at the glowing garden with deep satisfaction. "The balance is kept," he murmured. "Light in the darkness, warmth in the cold." Elara watched the gentle glow. She realized that the island had its own way of dealing with the night. It didn't fight the dark. It just saved pieces of the day to make the night less lonely. She went to bed that night, leaving the curtains open. The golden light from the garden filtered into her room, a nightlight powered by the sun itself. Logbook entry, March 20th. Uncovered the equinox cache, planted sun stars. The garden now glows at night with stored sunlight. It is the most cheerful thing I have ever seen. Note, the earth remembers the sun even when it is gone. The mirror pool. April brought rain, but it was a gentle, washing rain that scrubbed the salt from the rocks and turned the moss on the island a vibrant, electric green. The ocean settled into a calm lull. The waves stopped crashing and started lapping, a gentle sound like a cat drinking milk. Elara decided to explore the southern tip of the island, a place of jagged rocks and deep tidal pools that were usually inaccessible due to the spray. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. She picked her way across the rocks, carrying her walking stick. Barnaby, feeling adventurous due to the lack of wind, followed a few paces behind, inspecting every crevice for crabs. Near the water's edge, Elara found it. It was a perfectly round tidal pool, seemingly carved into the black basalt by a giant drill. The water inside was completely still. Not a ripple disturbed the surface. It was so clear that it was invisible. It looked like a hole leading straight down into the center of the earth. Elara leaned over to look at the starfish at the bottom. But she didn't see starfish. She looked at her reflection, but the reflection wasn't quite right. The Elara in the pool was wearing a yellow raincoat. The real Elara was wearing a blue sweater. The Elara in the pool was smiling and holding up a large, spiraled shell. The real Elara was holding a walking stick. "Curious," Elara whispered. She crouched down. She touched the surface of the water with her finger. Clip. Ripples spread outward. When the water stilled again, the image changed. Now the reflection showed the cottage, but the cottage was covered in climbing roses that reached all the way to the roof. The garden was overflowing with vegetables. There was a swing on the porch. It was the cottage, but in the future, or perhaps a version of the cottage that Elara dreamed of. "It is a scrying pool," a voice rippled through the air. Elara looked around. There was no ghost nearby. The voice seemed to come from the water itself. She looked back into the pool. A face appeared next to her reflection. It was the Selkie she had met months ago. But the Selkie wasn't in the pool. She was projecting her image there. "It shows the heart's quiet wishes," the Selkie's voice whispered in Elara's mind. "It shows what could be." Elara watched the surface. The images drifted by like clouds. She saw herself sitting by the fire with an old man. Silas, perhaps, or maybe a friend who would visit one day. She saw Barnaby, fat and happy, sleeping on a pile of fresh catnip. She saw the lighthouse beam shining through a storm, strong and unwavering. It wasn't a fortune-telling device. It didn't predict disasters or lottery numbers. It simply showed moments of peace. Barnaby trotted up to the edge of the pool. He peered in. Elara leaned over to see what the cat saw. In the reflection, Barnaby was the size of a tiger. He was sitting on top of a mountain of tuna fish. He was wearing a small golden crown. Elara laughed aloud. The sound echoed off the rocks, startling a seagull. "Ambitions of a king," Elara said, scratching Barnaby's ears. She sat by the mirror pool for an hour, watching the gentle, happy scenes drift by. It was a relief. Sometimes, living alone on a rock could make the mind turn inward, focusing on worries and loneliness. The pool reminded her that there was beauty in the future. There were roses to be planted. There were friends to be made. The tide began to turn. A wave splashed over the lip of the rock, disturbing the surface of the pool. The clear water mixed with the foam of the ocean. The images dissolved. The pool became just a pool again, filled with anemones and small stones. Elara stood up. She felt lighter, as if she had just had a long conversation with a good friend. She walked back to the cottage, looking at the bare stone walls. Roses, she thought. I should plant climbing roses this year. She went into the kitchen and made a pot of tea. She sat at the table with Horatio ticking softly nearby. She felt a sense of anticipation. The future wasn't a scary, blank fog. It was a garden waiting to be planted. She opened the logbook. April 14th. Found the mirror pool on the south point. It does not reflect the face, but the hope. Barnaby believes he is royalty. I suspect he already knew this. I saw the cottage covered in flowers. Tomorrow I will order rose seeds. Note, the water knows what we need before we do. She closed the book, smiling as Barnaby groomed his paw, looking every inch the king of the island. The cloud ship. May arrived with a gentle warmth, but on the first Tuesday of the month, the sky behaved strangely. It wasn't raining, yet the clouds had descended. They didn't hang in the sky as distant fluff. They sank low, settling around the waist of the lighthouse like a heavy white skirt. From the ground, the top of the tower was invisible. From the lantern room, the ground was gone. Elara stood on the gallery walkway, wrapped in a shawl. The air felt different up here today. It wasn't wet like fog. It was dry and soft, smelling of ozone and high-altitude winds. She looked out over the railing. Usually, there was a drop of 100 feet to the jagged rocks below. Today, there was only a floor of white cloud, looking solid enough to walk on. Then she saw the prow. Emerging silently from the cloud bank was a ship. It wasn't a sea vessel. It had no keel for water. It was a galleon made of lighter wood, balsa or perhaps cork, polished to a pale shine. Its sails were not canvas, but sheets of gossamer silk that caught the non-existent breeze. The ship drifted closer until it bumped gently against the railing of the lighthouse gallery. It didn't grate or crash. It felt like a pillow bumping against a wall. A gangplank made of woven wicker descended, resting on the lighthouse railing. A man stepped out. He wore a coat that seemed to shift colors, blue one moment, gray the next. He tipped a hat made of a single large feather. "Good evening, keeper," he said. His voice was airy and light like a flute. "Fine weather for a docking." "You're sailing the clouds," Elara said, staring at the impossible ship. "The trade winds," he corrected gently. "I am a sky merchant. We usually stay above 10,000 feet, but the pressure is low today. We needed to come down for ballast. He looked at the lighthouse lantern, admiring the glass. Beautiful beacon. We see it often from above. It looks like a star that fell into the ocean. He leaned against the railing. We are a bit light. The ship is drifting too high. We need something heavy, something of the earth. Elara thought for a moment. I have salt, she said. Sea salt, heavy, coarse, and very grounding. The merchant's eyes lit up. Salt is perfect. It holds the memory of the ocean. It anchors the keel. Elara ran down the spiral stairs. She went to the pantry and retrieved a large ceramic jar filled with gray sea salt she had harvested from the crystal cave. It was heavy and dense. She climbed back up. Her legs burned, but her curiosity pushed her on. She handed the jar to the merchant. He took it with both hands, weighing it. Excellent, he said. This will keep us steady through the turbulence. He turned to his ship. Now, a trade is a trade. What can I offer the keeper of the stone tower? He reached into a chest on the deck of his cloud ship. He pulled out a bolt of fabric. It shimmered. As he unrolled a length of it, the color changed. At one angle, it was the soft pink of dawn. At another, it was the burning orange of sunset. In the shadows, it turned a deep, bruised violet. Sunset silk, the merchant said, draping it over the railing. Woven from the scattered light of the dusk, it never fades. It holds the warmth of the ending day forever. He cut a generous length with a pair of silver shears. The fabric didn't fall. It floated, settling gently into Elara's arms. It felt weightless, yet incredibly warm. Thank you, Elara whispered. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever held. Fair winds, keeper, the merchant said. He pulled up the wicker gangplank. The ship pushed off gently. It drifted back into the white embrace of the clouds. The sails filled with a silent wind, and the vessel dissolved into the mist, heading upward, back to the jet streams where it belonged. Elara stood on the gallery alone. She carried the fabric down to the cottage. She draped it over the back of her reading chair. Instantly, the corner of the room seemed to glow. Even though it was mid-afternoon, that specific chair looked like it was bathed in the golden hour of sunset. Barnaby jumped onto the chair. He kneaded the fabric with his paws, purring loudly. He seemed to understand that this was a patch of eternal sunshine. Elara sat down, wrapping the sunset silk around her shoulders. It warmed her back. It made the room feel cozy and safe, suspended in that perfect moment between day and night. She opened the logbook. May 7th. A ship docked at the gallery today. Not from the sea, but from the sky. Traded a jar of salt for a yard of sunset. The fabric is woven light. It reminds me that even when the clouds are thick, the sun is always shining somewhere above them. The librarian of the deep. June brought the calmest waters of the year. The Atlantic Ocean lay flat and oily, moving with a slow, hypnotic heave that barely broke against the shore. It was a morning of silence. The gulls were quiet. The wind was holding its breath. Elara was walking the beach, looking for driftwood, when she saw the rock. It was a massive, dark boulder sitting on the sand near the water's edge. She frowned. She knew every rock on this beach. That boulder hadn't been there yesterday. As she approached, the boulder moved. It let out a deep, heavy sigh that stirred the sand. It wasn't a rock, it was a turtle. But not a normal sea turtle. This creature was colossal. Its shell was the size of a small car, covered in barnacles, moss, and ancient scars. Its skin was leathery and wrinkled, the color of old teak. It turned its head slowly to look at Elara. Its eyes were black and wise, filled with the patience of centuries. "Greetings, Landwalker," a voice rumbled. It didn't move its beak. The voice seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "Greetings, Traveler," Elara replied, bowing slightly. She knew by now to treat everything on this island with respect. The turtle shifted its weight, digging its flippers deeper into the cool sand. "I am Ocean," the turtle rumbled. "I carry the library." Elara looked closer at the shell. What she had thought were barnacles were actually tubes. Dozens of them, made of calcified coral and sealed with wax, were attached to the turtle's back. "The history of the currents," Ocean explained. "The maps of the deep trenches, the songs of the whales, I carry them all." He let out another heavy sigh, sounding exhausted. "But my eyes, they grow dim with time. The salt has clouded them. I cannot read the star map to find the warm current." He looked at Elara. "Can you read Keeper?" "I can," Elara said softly. "On my back," Ocean directed. "The third tube from the left, the blue wax." Elara stepped forward. She reached out and touched the shell. It was warm and rough. She found the tube with the blue seal. She gently pried the wax cap off. She pulled out a scroll. It wasn't paper. It was a thin, preserved sheet of kelp, dark green and translucent. The writing on it was etched in silver ink. It was a map of the ocean floor, but it moved. The lines of the currents swirled on the page. It says, Elara squinted at the shifting silver lines. "It says the Gulf Stream has shifted 3 miles east. You need to pass the sunken wreck of the Victory, then turn left at the volcanic vent." The turtle listened intently, his head nodding slowly. 3 miles east," he repeated. "And the vent. Yes, I remember the warmth of the vent." He looked at Elara with gratitude. "You have saved me a long, cold journey, Keeper. A librarian is useless if he cannot read his own books." "Why do you carry them?" Elara asked, rolling the kelp scroll back up and sealing it in the tube. "Because the ocean forgets," Ocean said simply. "The water changes every second. Someone must remember where it has been." He began to turn, a slow, lumbering process that involved much heaving of sand. "I have a gift for the reader," Ocean said. He lifted his left flipper. Lying in the depression in the sand was a single, perfect scale from his shell. It was the size of a dinner plate, polished and patterned with swirls of amber and brown. "A lens," he said. "Look through it and you will see the age of things." With a final, deep breath, he pushed himself into the water. Elara watched as the heavy body became weightless in the ocean. He glided away, a living island of knowledge, disappearing into the deep blue. Elara picked up the scale. It was light, like plastic, but warm. She held it up to her eye and looked at a rock. Through the amber scale, the rock didn't look gray. It looked layered. She could see the pressure that formed it. She looked at a piece of driftwood. She saw the ghost of the tree it had once been. She looked at the lighthouse. She saw the stone, but she also saw the light of all the fires that had ever burned there, stacked on top of each other like a pillar of gold. "The librarian's lens," she whispered. She walked back to the cottage, holding the scale carefully. She placed it on the mantelpiece next to the jar of green Aurora light. That evening, she sat by the fire, looking through the scale at Barnaby. Through the lens, the cat looked like a small, fierce lion, glowing with a hunter's spirit. Elara smiled. Oisin was right. The world was full of history if you just had the right eyes to see it. She opened the logbook. June 14th. Met Oisin, the librarian of the deep. A giant turtle carrying the ocean's memories on his back. Helped him read a map. He gave me a lens that shows the truth of things. Note, being slow does not mean you are lost. It just means you are carrying a heavy load. She closed the book and watched the firelight dance through the amber scale, turning the room into a warm, golden memory. The Storm Petrel's Lullaby. July usually brought heat, but on the island the weather was a fickle friend. Without warning, a summer gale rolled in from the northeast. It wasn't cold, but it was fierce. The sky turned a bruised, yellowish gray, and the wind whipped the ocean into a frenzy of white caps. It was late evening. The sun had set behind the storm clouds, leaving the world in a premature twilight. Elara was up in the lantern room. The wind was so strong that she could feel the tower swaying slightly beneath her feet, a gentle, rhythmic flex that the architect had designed to prevent the stone from cracking. She checked the rotation of the great lens. It was humming steadily. Then she saw something flutter against the glass. It was a small, dark shape, battered by the wind, pinned against the thick pane by the sheer force of the gale. It was a bird. Elara didn't hesitate. She unlocked the heavy iron door that led onto the gallery. The wind tried to rip the handle from her grip, roaring in her ears. She pushed out, squinting against the stinging rain. She reached for the small bundle of feathers. The bird was exhausted, its tiny claws scrabbling uselessly against the smooth glass. Elara cupped her hands around it. It was incredibly light, like holding a handful of hollow bones and air. She pulled it close to her chest, shielding it with her coat, and retreated back inside, slamming the iron door shut and locking out the roar of the storm. In the sudden quiet of the lantern room, she looked at her rescue. It was a storm petrel, a tiny seabird, black as soot, with a patch of white on its rump. They were known as Mother Carey's chickens, the birds that walked on water. It wasn't moving. Its eyes were closed. Elara carried it down the spiral stairs, protecting it from the draft. In the kitchen, the fire was blazing. Barnaby looked up from his rug, his hunter's instinct peaking, but Elara gave him a stern look. "This is a guest, Barnaby, not a snack." She fetched a shoebox and lined it with a soft towel. She placed the box on the warm hearth. She mixed a little sugar into warm water and offered a drop to the bird on the tip of her finger. The bird stirred. It opened its beak and drank, once, twice. Then it opened its eyes. They were not the flat, black eyes of a normal bird. They swirled with gray mist. They looked like tiny, contained hurricanes. The bird stood up. It shook its feathers, sending a spray of seawater onto the hearth. And then it began to sing. It wasn't a chirp or a squawk. It was a melody. It started low, a soft trilling sound that matched the frequency of the wind outside. Then it shifted. The bird sang a counter melody. It was a song of calm. As the birds sang, the atmosphere in the cottage changed. The rattling of the windows stopped. The fire settled down from a roar to a gentle purr. Elara walked to the window. Outside, the storm was still raging. The waves were still crashing. But around the lighthouse, in a circle perhaps 50 feet wide, the air was still. The rain fell straight down. The wind parted around the tower like a river flowing around a stone. A storm singer, Elara whispered. She had read about them in Silas's old books. Birds that carried the eye of the storm within them. They were the peacekeepers of the gale. The birds sang for an hour. It was a beautiful, hypnotic sound, like a flute played in a library. Elara sat in her armchair, feeling a deep, heavy relaxation spread through her limbs. The anxiety of the storm vanished. Horatio, the clockwork crab, climbed up onto the edge of the shoebox. He watched the bird with his ruby eyes, his gears clicking in time with the song. The bird didn't seem to mind the mechanical audience. Eventually, the bird tucked its head under its wing. The song stopped. But the bubble of calm remained. The lighthouse stood in its own private pocket of peace while the rest of the Atlantic howled. Elara slept in the chair that night, guarding the tiny creature. In the morning, the gale had blown itself out. The sky was a brilliant, washed clean blue. Elara took the shoebox out to the gallery. She lifted the lid. The storm petrel hopped onto her finger. Its grip was strong now. It looked at her with those stormy, gray eyes, dipped its head once, and launched itself into the air. It didn't fly away immediately. It circled the lighthouse tower 3 times, a blessing, or perhaps a thank you, before turning east, skimming low over the waves, dancing on the water. Elara watched it go, until it was just a speck against the horizon. She opened the logbook. July 14th. A summer gale brought a storm petrel to the glass. It spent the night by the fire. It sang a lullaby that pushed the wind away. I learned that even the smallest things can command the greatest forces if they know the right song. The painted door. August brought the heat, and with it, a strange kind of longing. Living on a rock in the ocean was beautiful, but it was also monochromatic. Everything was blue, gray, or white. There were no forests, no meadows, no smell of drying pine needles or damp earth. Elara found herself missing the smell of trees. She was down in the basement storage room, taking inventory of the winter preserves. The basement was a cluttered, shadowy place filled with crates that hadn't been moved in decades. She pushed aside a stack of old canvas tarps to reach a shelf. Behind the tarps, she found a door. It wasn't a real door. It was painted directly onto the stone wall. It was framed in painted green vines. The door itself was depicted as heavy oak, with iron hinges and a round brass handle. The painting was incredibly realistic, done in oils that had barely faded. Silas, Elara called out softly. The ghost shimmered into existence near a stack of firewood. He looked at the painting and smiled fondly. "Ah," he said, "the green door. Madame Oleander commissioned that. She missed the woods, you see. She grew up in a valley full of ferns." "It's beautiful," Elara said, tracing the painted grain of the wood. "But why paint a door that goes nowhere?" "Who says it goes nowhere?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "It goes to the memory." He gestured for her to try the handle. Elara reached out, her hand expected to touch cold, rough stone. Instead, her fingers closed around a warm, smooth brass knob. It was solid. She turned it. Click. The painted door swung outward, away from the wall. Beyond the door, there was no tunnel, no room. There was a sensation. Elara stepped closer. She didn't walk through. She couldn't really. The space beyond was a swirl of light and shadow, but as she stood in the threshold, the air hit her. It smelled of pine resin, heated by the sun. It smelled of damp ferns and rich, black soil. It smelled of wild strawberries. Elara closed her eyes and inhaled. It was intoxicating. She could hear things, too. The rustle of birch leaves, the distant hammering of a woodpecker, the buzzing of bees in a meadow. It was a sensory portal. It didn't transport her body, it transported her senses. Go on, Silas encouraged. Sit. Elara sat on the dusty floor of the basement, her back against a crate, facing the open, painted door. She closed her eyes and let the forest wash over her. She felt the phantom sensation of soft moss beneath her fingers. She felt the dappled sunlight on her face, filtering through a canopy of leaves. It was a relief. Her eyes, tired of the endless horizon and the glare of the water, rested in the imagined greenery. Her lungs, used to the sharp bite of salt, expanded with the rich, loamy air. Barnaby trotted down the stairs. He sniffed the air, his tail puffing up. He smelled the forest, too. He walked right up to the threshold and lay down, rolling onto his back as if he were squirming in dry leaves. Elara and the cat spent the afternoon there, taking a vacation from the ocean without ever leaving the basement. They soaked up the forest energy. After an hour, the smell began to fade. The sounds grew faint. The magic was finite, a brief respite, not a permanent escape. Elara stood up and gently closed the painted door. It clicked shut and became just a painting on a stone wall again. A very good painting, but flat and lifeless. "Thank you, Madame Oleander," she whispered. She went back upstairs to the kitchen. The ocean outside looked different now. Having tasted the forest, she appreciated the sea more. The blue looked deeper, the white foam brighter. She realized that the island provided everything she needed. Even when she missed the mainland, the lighthouse had a way of giving her a taste of it, just enough to keep her heart settled. She opened the logbook. August 20th. Found the painted door in the cellar. It is a portal to the woods. I smelled pine and strawberries. Barnaby chased invisible chipmunks. It is a good thing to remember that walls are only as solid as we believe them to be. She made a cup of pine needle tea, using dried needles from her pantry, to linger in the mood, and watched the sunset turn the ocean to liquid copper. The lighthouse keeper's birthday. September on Silver Point was a season of gold. The light changed from the white glare of summer to a rich, heavy amber. The sea oats on the dunes turned the color of wheat, rustling dryly in the breeze. It was the 21st of September, Elara's birthday. She hadn't told anyone. There was no one to tell, really. The mail boat wasn't due for another week, and her friends on the mainland were busy with their own lives. She woke up deciding to treat it like any other day. She made her coffee. She fed Barnaby. She checked the barometer. But the island seemed to know. When she walked into the kitchen, The morning light was hitting the glass jars on the shelves in a way that created a perfect rainbow across the wooden table. It looked like a streamer made of light. Barnaby was unusually attentive. Instead of demanding his breakfast with a loud meow, he nudged her leg gently. He dropped something at her feet. It wasn't a dead mouse, thankfully. It was a seagull feather. But not just any feather, it was pure white, pristine, and tipped with a distinct silver gray. A perfect quill. "Thank you, Barnaby," Elara smiled, picking it up. "It's beautiful." She went about her chores. She polished the brass rails in the tower. Usually, this was hard, cold work. But today, the metal seemed to warm under her hands faster than usual. The tarnish wiped away with a single stroke. The tower hummed a low, contented note that felt like a greeting. In the afternoon, she went down to the cove to check for driftwood. On the bottom step of the stone path, resting just above the high tide line, was a small, neat pile of kelp. And resting on top of the kelp was a shell. It was an oyster shell, rough and gray on the outside, but it had been pried open. Inside, sitting in the cup of mother of pearl, was a single, perfect pearl. It wasn't round and white like a jewelry store pearl. It was teardrop-shaped and shimmered with hues of blue and pink. Elara looked out at the water. The surface was calm, but she saw a sleek, dark head bob up 50 yards offshore. The seal watched her for a moment, blinked its large, dark eyes, and slipped silently beneath the surface. "Thank you," Elara whispered to the ocean. "A gift from the Selkie." She returned to the cottage as the sun began to set. She decided to bake herself a small cake, just a simple vanilla sponge. As she mixed the batter, she realized she was humming. And then, she realized the cottage was humming with her. The fire in the hearth wasn't just burning, it was popping in a rhythm. Pop, crackle, pop. It sounded like applause. Horatio, the clockwork crab, was scuttling back and forth across the mantelpiece. He had found a piece of red sea glass somewhere and was holding it up in his claws, catching the firelight, creating a tiny disco ball effect on the ceiling. Silas materialized in his armchair. He looked particularly solid tonight, wearing his dress uniform with the brass buttons fully polished. "Happy return," Silas said, tipping his cap. "Another year around the sun, another year keeping the light." "I didn't think you knew," Elara said, putting the cake in the oven. "The island keeps a calendar," Silas smiled. "The wind changes on this day every year. It becomes kinder." They sat together while the cake baked. The smell of vanilla and sugar filled the room, masking the scent of the sea. When the cake was done, Elara placed it on the table. She didn't have birthday candles, so she placed the jar of green aurora light in the center of the table. It cast a festive, magical glow over the icing. She cut 2 slices, one for herself and a tiny crumb for Barnaby. She sat in the quiet, warm kitchen, surrounded by her strange family. A ghost, a clockwork crab, a cat, and the spirit of the lighthouse itself. She realized she wasn't alone at all. She had never been less alone. The beam of the lighthouse swept past the window. Flash. It felt like a wink. Elara ate her cake. It tasted of sweetness and peace. She opened the logbook. September 21st. It is my birthday. I received a pearl from a seal, a feather from a cat, and a light show from a crab. The wind is gentle. I am 1 year older, and the lighthouse is 1 year stronger. Note, the best parties are the quiet ones. The constellation fish. October brought the clear, crisp nights where the boundary between the sea and the sky seemed to vanish. It was the dark of the moon again. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of spilled milk. Elara was up in the lantern room, performing the midnight check on the oil reserves for the backup generator. Silas was with her, standing on the gallery, looking down at the water. "Come here, lass," he called softly. "They are passing through." Elara stepped out into the cold night air. She joined him at the railing. "Look down," Silas pointed. "Not at the horizon, directly down." Elara looked. The water around the island was usually a black void at night, but tonight it was sparkling. At first, Elara thought it was just the reflection of the stars above. "It's a clear night," she said. "The water is like a mirror." "Look closer," Silas urged. "The reflection is moving." Elara squinted. He was right. The stars in the water weren't stationary. They were swimming. It was a school of fish, thousands of them. They were small, sleek creatures, and along their sides ran lines of bioluminescent scales. But they didn't just glow randomly. As the school moved together, turning and shifting in the current, the patterns on their sides aligned. For a moment, the school formed a perfect spiral. Then, they shifted, stretching out into a long, shimmering belt that looked exactly like the Milky Way above. "Constellation fish," Silas whispered. "Stargazers. They migrate once a year from the deep trenches. They navigate by mimicking the sky." It was a breathtaking optical illusion. It looked as if the sky had fallen into the ocean. The stars above and the stars below were moving in a synchronized dance. "As above, so below," Elara murmured. The school swirled around the base of the lighthouse. The water glowed with a soft, blue-white luminescence. Elara felt a sense of vertigo. Standing on the high gallery, looking down at the starry water and up at the starry sky, she felt untethered. It was as if the lighthouse were a rocket ship floating in deep space, surrounded by galaxies on all sides. Horatio, who had bravely climbed the stairs, a feat that took him an hour, sat on the railing. He clicked his claws at the fish. One of the fish, seeing the glint of the brass crab, leaped out of the water, a tiny arc of light, before splashing back down. "They are feeding on the starlight," Silas said poetically. "Or so the old sailors said. They surfaced to recharge their shine." They watched for an hour. The school moved like a single organism, a liquid constellation flowing around the island. Eventually, a leader fish turned toward the deep water. The rest followed. The river of light flowed away from the island, fading slowly into the depths until the ocean was black again. The real stars remained overhead, fixed and silent. Elara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "The ocean holds everything," she said, "even the sky." "Aye," Silas agreed, fading back into the brickwork. "It's all one big mirror, Elara. We're just the ones polishing the glass." Elara walked back down the stairs, feeling dizzy with the beauty of it. She sat at her desk. She didn't turn on the lamp. She wrote by the light of the moonflower jar. October 15th. Witnessed the constellation fish. The ocean became the sky. I stood between two galaxies. It is hard to feel small when you are standing in the center of the universe. Note, sometimes the most beautiful stars are the ones that can swim. She went to sleep, dreaming that her bed was a boat floating through the Milky Way. The Keeper of the Keys. November brought the first true frost to Silver Point. The island turned silver in the mornings, the grass coated in a delicate layer of ice that crunched softly underfoot. Elara was in the cottage, reorganizing the key hook by the door. There were keys for the tower, keys for the generator shed, keys for the pantry. But at the back of the drawer, wrapped in a piece of velvet, she found a small wooden box she had never noticed before. She opened it. Inside lay 4 keys. They were not made of iron or brass. They looked like they were carved from different materials. One was made of pale, clouded glass. One was made of gray slate. One was made of dried, twisted root. One was made of clear quartz. They were beautiful, but they had no teeth. They were smooth rods. "You found them," Silas said. He was sitting in the armchair, watching the fire. "What do they open?" Elara asked, holding up the glass key. "There are no locks like this in the tower." "They don't open doors, Elara," Silas said softly. "They open moods." He stood up and walked to the door. "Come, the wind is biting today. Your roses are suffering." Elara followed him outside. The wind was indeed sharp, whipping around the corner of the cottage. Her climbing roses, usually resilient, were thrashing against the trellis. Silas pointed to a large, jagged boulder standing alone near the cliff edge. It had a small, natural hole bored through its center by centuries of wind. "The wind stone," Silas said. "Use the glass key." Elara approached the boulder. She felt foolish, but she inserted the smooth glass key into the rough hole in the stone. It fit perfectly. "Turn it gently," Silas instructed. "To the left for a breeze, to the right for a gale, center it for calm." Elara turned the key slightly to the left. It moved with a feeling like turning a spoon in thick honey. Immediately, the air changed. The sharp, biting gust died down. It didn't stop completely. That would be unnatural, but it softened. It became a gentle, manageable breeze that rustled the roses instead of beating them. Elara looked at Silas in wonder. "I can control the weather." "No," Silas corrected sternly. "You can tune it. You cannot stop a hurricane and you cannot make rain in a drought, but you can adjust the comfort of the island. You are the keeper. The island listens to your suggestions." He pointed to the garden soil. "The root key fits into the roots of the old oak. It encourages the earth to be warm in winter." He pointed to the sky. "The slate key fits into a notch in the gallery railing. It invites the fog to lift." Elara spent the afternoon learning the instrument of her island. She used the root key to warm the soil around her snowdrops. She used the quartz key on a reflective rock near the cove to catch the last rays of the sun and hold them longer. She realized that the keys were not magic wands. They were a line of communication. They were a way of asking the elements to be kind. That evening, the cottage felt different. The draft under the door was gone. The fire burned more evenly. Elara hung the velvet box back on the hook, right next to the front door key. She looked at Horatio, the clockwork crab, who was ticking contentedly on the rug. The island was a machine of nature, and she was finally learning how to operate the dials. Logbook entry, November 15th. Found the elemental keys, tuned the wind to a G minor breeze, warmed the garden. The island is not wild. It is domesticated if you know how to speak its language. The Grand Assembly. The winter solstice arrived, the longest night of the year. On the mainland, people were lighting candles and gathering for parties. On Silver Point, the preparations were different. Elara felt an anticipation in the air all day. The ocean was unnaturally calm, like a sheet of dark satin. The gulls had gone silent. "Wear your best coat," Madame Oleander's voice drifted from the kitchen, where she was inspecting the spice rack. "Tonight is the changing." "The changing of what?" Elara asked. "The guard," Oleander whispered and vanished. At midnight, Elara climbed to the top of the lighthouse. She stepped out onto the gallery. The beam was turning rhythmically, cutting a swath of light through the darkness. And in that light, she saw them. They were all there. Down in the cove, sitting on the wet rocks, was the Selkie. She was in her human form, wearing her seal's skin like a cloak. She looked up and raised a pale hand. In the shallow water, a massive dark shape floated. It was Oshin, the librarian turtle. His shell broke the surface like a small island, ancient and steady. On the railing of the lighthouse gallery, perched bravely against the cold, was the storm petrel she had saved. It sang a single, high, pure note. And standing around Elara, on the walkway were the ghosts. Silas in his uniform, Madame Oleander in her gardening apron, Captain Tobias puffing on his pipe, Ignatius, the glassblower, glowing with a warm orange light. They formed a circle around her. There were no speeches. There was no ceremony with scrolls or crowns. There was simply a witnessing. Silas stepped forward. He reached out and touched the brass railing of the lighthouse. Then he looked at Elara and nodded. "We kept the light for our time," he said, his voice sounding like the ocean itself. "We are the echoes, you are the voice." Madame Oleander stepped forward. She placed a spectral hand over Elara's heart. "We tended the soil, you are the root." Ignatius stepped forward. "We blew the glass, you are the fire." Elara felt a warmth rushing through her. It wasn't just the warmth of the sunset silk she was wearing. It was a feeling of total acceptance. She looked down at Barnaby, who was sitting at her feet. Horatio the crab was perched on Barnaby's head. Even the animals stood tall and solemn. Elara realized what this was. They were passing the mantle. She was no longer the new girl. She wasn't just a visitor renting the cottage. She was the matriarch of Silver Point. She was the anchor that held all these spirits and creatures together. She looked out at the ocean. She felt the keys in her pocket. She felt the vibration of the singing cave below. She smelled the moonflowers drying in the kitchen. "I accept," Elara whispered to the wind. "I will keep the light." The Selkie down on the rocks let out a soft, melodious call. The turtle dipped his head. The ghosts smiled, their forms becoming translucent, blending with the starlight. "Then we rest," Silas said gently. "We will always be here, Elara, but the watch is yours." One by one, they faded. Not leaving, just stepping back into the fabric of the lighthouse. Elara stood alone on the gallery, but she felt crowded with love. She looked up at the great glass lens. It was her charge, her responsibility, her friend. She stayed there until the first hint of dawn turned the eastern sky to gray. She felt stronger than she had ever felt in her life. She was a lighthouse keeper, and her family was made of salt, stone, and memory. Logbook entry, December 21st. The assembly met at midnight. The watch was past. I am the keeper of the silver mists. I am home. The eternal light. A year had passed. It was evening again on Silver Point. The cycle had turned full circle. Elara sat in the armchair by the fire. The cottage was warm, filled with the scent of anchor tea and old wood. The cottage looked different now. The driftwood library covered one entire wall, filled with the stories of the sea. The jars of aurora light, green, violet, pink, glowed softly on the mantelpiece. The star chart blanket was draped over the sofa. Horatio clicked softly as he walked along the baseboards, patrolling for dust bunnies. Barnaby was asleep on his back, dreaming of tuna kingdoms. Elara closed the heavy leather cover of the logbook. It was full. A year of impossible things, recorded in ink. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the ocean was breathing. In, out, in, out. It was a sound that used to keep her awake. Now, it was the only sound that could put her to sleep. She realized that she had changed. Her eyes saw things others missed. Her hands knew how to heal glass and calm winds. Her heart beat in time with the tides. She picked up her lantern and climbed the spiral stairs one last time for the night. Clang, clang, clang. She reached the lantern room. It was warm up here, heated by the friction of the great machine. Elara checked the oil. She checked the wick. She polished a smudge from the brass. She looked out into the vast, consuming darkness of the Atlantic. Somewhere out there, ships were navigating the black water. They were looking for her. They were looking for the flash of Silver Point to tell them where they were. To tell them they were safe. I am here, Elara whispered to the ships. I am watching. She flipped the switch, or perhaps in this magical place, she just willed it. The great lens began to turn. Come then. The beam swung out, a solid bar of light cutting through the night. It swept over the waves, illuminating the white caps, touching the horizon and circling back. Flash, darkness, flash, darkness. It was a hypnotic rhythm, a lullaby made of light. Elara stood there for a long time, bathed in the glow. She felt a deep, heavy peace settle into her bones. There was nowhere else she needed to be. There was nothing else she needed to do. The past was recorded in the driftwood. The future was growing in the garden. The present was just this: the light, the dark, and the safety in between. She walked back down the stairs. She extinguished the lantern in the kitchen. She climbed into her bed under the eaves. The sheets were cool and smelled of lavender. Above her, she could hear the gentle hum of the tower. You are safe, the tower hummed. You are home, the ocean whispered. We are here, the ghosts murmured. Elara closed her eyes. She drifted away, carried on the beam of the lighthouse, sailing into a deep, dreamless silver sleep. The end.